Hello everyone, it's time for this week's live stream. I wanted to let you know that I tried to start on time, but I could not get my software to talk to more software. I was like, ugh, so I give up. Not going to do it. Thank you, Rogers Refood, for being a sponsor of this channel. So, I've been talking for how many minutes with no sound? That's it. Let's just start the show all over again. Oh my god. Why? Well, the good news is Jack was making all kinds of noise. You didn't hear any of it. Thank you guys for telling me so much, so many times that there was no sound. It's ridiculous. I saw it said mute. I unmuted, but it didn't work. And now it's moving my camera. The whole computer is like living its own life today. I don't like that. So let me see if I can stop that. So I'm wearing my coral shirt. It only took 18 months to get it. I had to update my software to the latest version, and so I was working with it yesterday and made sure everything was good, and it didn't recognize my webcam, it didn't recognize this, I got it all operational, and then I turn around and I look at everything, and it's like, yeah, but it's still not working right. So I just spent, the last 20 minutes trying to get my iPad to talk to the software, and it does not appear in there. And I watched a quick tutorial on how to get it connected. I did what it said, did not work. We don't have the slides I want to use today for this topic. So I've got the slides. I'm just going to have to use it as my cheat sheet as we discuss things that you can do to make your aquarium run better. I was just in a chat with a friend this morning who's been complaining about his sump. And he wanted a new sump, and he's like, what can you build me that'll fit there? And but his space is very, very constrained. So, I'm trying to help him make what he owns already work better. And he said, this doesn't work, and that doesn't work, and it's absurd, and it's a bad design. And, I went through the whole process trying to figure it out. But I didn't have any luck. I couldn't figure out what to do, and I had to stop. I had to come help you guys. But ultimately, whenever it comes to making your tank better, the very first step is clean everything. Clean top to bottom. And this is my own thing. I've been working on the little 1 gallon trying to make it prettier. If you look there in the background, you'll see that it's got some green stuff in there now. I put that in yesterday because Dennis, who goes by Tiger Boy on Instagram, has been really pushing the macroalgae angle now for, I'd say, over 2 years. Maybe longer, maybe 3. And, that tank there was kind of boring. It has the skeleton of a barnacle and it has a blenny in there and some hermits, but it needed some color. And for now, I thought macroalgae I can put in there, and I can snip off leaves as time allows to make it look better. By the way, I did notice last week that Jack was doing naughty things in the background. If she does it again, that's just her living her best life. So enjoy the hilarious background antics. Okay, after you've got everything clean, you can inspect it. You can make sure that everything looks good. You can find if there's a frayed wire or if there's something that's cracked or broken. Just someone recently posted in the Hydros group that the roller that goes over their dosing pump had a cracked lid. And I thought, well, okay, it's the lid. But apparently that crack makes a difference and makes it not flow properly, which is crazy to me because I feel like it's just the plastic shell. But because he brought it up, other people said things and I learned something new. So, inspect everything. Make sure everything's working correctly and make sure that it's not damaged, or if it is damaged, is it operating still okay or has it gone off the rails? Because in the example of that dosing pump, I guess with a cracked housing around where the tube just rolls in a circle, it would change the flow rate and you wouldn't get what you think you're dosing to your tank. You want to be aware, very, very aware. If you're oblivious to your tank and you're not keeping an eye on it, if you're just kind of like, it's running, it's okay, the fish are swimming right side up, then that's kind of the results you're going to get. But if you're cleaning it and I said that already before, but if you're keenly aware of the operation of your aquarium, if you can wake up from a dead sleep and know something's not right, now you're being aware. Now you're perfect. And that's what we want to do. We want to be on top of things and we want to but still apply something that Dwayne calls, I think it was Dwayne, maybe it was Joe, careful neglect. And I kind of like that because I don't want your hands in the tank all the time. I want you to leave it alone and let it grow. And the less you are pulling things out and putting things in and moving things around, the better for your reef. It really does better with a hands-off approach, but at the same time, you have to do some things to keep it operational. You can't just say, oh, Mark said don't touch it. I can't put my hands in there. If you have to, you have to. But are you needing to do it all the time? Are you doing it too much? Because you're affecting everything every single time your hand goes in the water. Have a regular maintenance routine that you can rely upon. You want to be able to constantly just know what's next. If you're just kind of haphazard, like I change carbon occasionally, that's not regular routine. But if you say you change carbon every single month, like on the first, for example, that's a good routine. If you are cleaning your skimmer cup occasionally, or you only clean it when it overflows into the sump, that's not regular maintenance. Instead, that is damage control. So instead, what I would like to suggest is that you clean the cup more frequently. Back in the day, I had a collection cup that was pretty big, and I chose to remove it from the sump and clean it every single day, which I know you might think, wow, that's overkill. But you know what? It did two things. It made sure the cup was always clean, and I never had to risk it overflowing back into the sump, ever. And I was able to clean the neck. I actually had and still do, have a toilet brush that's made of all plastic parts. There's no metal in it, and I would use it to clean the inside neck of that large collection cup. And then I used it to clean the cup too. But the inside neck was always nice and clean, and that way the bubbles could rise up, and they weren't stopped prematurely because of slime or buildup on the neck of the collection cup. So, cleaning that cup on a regular basis would be good. Cleaning your pumps on a regular basis is another thing. And if you don't like the job, I understand. But at the same time, it's really important to clean on a regular basis, even if you are swapping parts out because of time constraints. So, for example, with my Vortex, I have a whole bunch of extra wet sides, which is the part that goes in the tank that has the propeller in it in the cage. And I can just pull a dirty one off and I can put it in something to soak and let it break down and become easier to clean, while a new one goes in the tank immediately to keep the flow in the aquarium. So if you're doing rotational equipment cleaning, you can constantly keep the tank running without having to take everything offline for a few hours while you're scrubbing things. And that kind of having those extra parts is also good because it's a backup if something fails. If one of those cages cracks or just fails, I just have to replace it, I have a backup. If the propeller's bad, I have a backup. If the magnet has split open, which happened occasionally in the past, I have a backup. So I could constantly just swap things out, take them apart, clean them, inspect them, like we talked about earlier, and make sure they're okay. One of the key things that you probably don't think is key, some of you, is you don't think you need a controller. You've never needed one before. Why do you need one now? It's just a price. It's a money grab, and it's going to stress you out. I disagree. I think a controller is a great tool. When I set up my 280-gallon tank back in 2004, it came with a controller, but it came with a damaged one. It was flooded. It was ruined, and I had to get it repaired. And then I hooked it up, and I grew to love it. And I've been using that brand of controller ever since, and it's the Apex controller. Back then it was called Aqua Controller, and then Aqua Controller 2, and then Aqua Controller 3, and now it's Apex, and there's A2, A3. I mean, there's Apex Classic. There's quite a few on the market. I've used pretty much all of them. The Apex lets me not only know what's going on with the tank, but will notify me when something goes wrong, and that is part of problem solving, because I'm able to be alerted to an issue prematurely. So what are my main things that I get alerted to? Number one, temperature is out of range. If the tank gets too hot or gets too cold, I get a notification. I love that. If my alkalinity gets too high or too low, I get a notification. If something gets wet in the stand where the sump is and the top-off container and the return pump, I get a notification. I also have this display module that I barely use. It's just kind of plugged in. It's like a $50 item, I think, maybe a little bit more. And I never use it, but it just lays on top of my console where I have all my electronics. And if I had to navigate through the brain of the Apex code, I could do it button by button. It would sort of be like the old days of texting with a keypad, and you had to write hello, and you had to push 335555. You had to spell out the letters. It's a little bit cumbersome like that, but you know what? It's still there as an option if I have nothing else that'll work and I have to make a change. But one of the things this little display does that nothing else in my house does is it has a little tiny bip. And it does this stupid bip continuously. So if I'm just sitting there and my phone is charging, my watch is charging, and I'm just watching a movie, I can hear bip, and I'm like, what's going on with the tank? Because the display module is now alerting me to a slight problem. And it could be that the top-off container is too full or whatever, but it makes me get up and check. It's a nice little option. If you have a controller, you can set it up with a string of red lights like Reef Dudes did. And any time the alarm was triggered, those lights would come on behind his aquarium and make it glow red, and he knew something wasn't wrong, and it made him investigate. You can do the same thing with a lamp or whatever. Another thing you can do is you can plug in something that makes sound. It could be some kind of I hate to say it, but a horn or an alarm or a siren, but you also need the ability to stop that sound effect once you're alerted. But it is a great way to draw your attention to the aquarium if something's going wrong. Now, I've been saying Apex, 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 but I set up Caitlin's Reef 2 years ago, and I bought a hydros for it. And that's just a 27-gallon tank, and yet I stuck a hydros on there to help control the temperature of the tank, let me know the pH, turn things on and off, let me hit a button so when I feed the tank, pumps stop. When I do a water change, turns everything off, but turns on automatically when I'm done. I love it. And then I set up this tank here behind me. And then I set this little tank next to it as well, and those are plugged into another hydros. And I do get notifications that one tank is cooled off too much, and my air conditioner vent is right above that tank. That tank is open top, and so it can get a little bit chilly, and it just lets me know that it's gotten below like 75.6 degrees. Like, all right, it's a little bit lower. And, it reminds me maybe I need to get a slightly better heater for that tank instead of the one it came with. Because, I don't know, that heater's a little bit goofy. Not only having the controller to alert you to a problem, the beauty of it is that the controller saves the data. So if something is going wrong with your tank, it's tracking it the whole time. And so you can find out when your heater failed. You can figure out, it happened 3 days ago. It hasn't worked. Or you get an alert. Like, for example, I would get an alert saying that my Nero 5 isn't using enough wattage. And I go check, and the propeller's not spinning. and it's outside of the range. It's too low. I've also had a notification in the past where my electricity from the city was coming in super erratically, and I would get these notifications that the amperage was wrong. So of course I'm investigating, and then I'm looking at all my logs, and I can see how the energy consumption, or let's just say the amperage, was just kind of doing this, kind of like a wave length, right? And instead it was erratic, like a horrible heartbeat. And I could see that's been going on like this for a while. And then I was able to go back to my records and figure out all the times when it was fine. I ended up printing out a bunch of pages when the linesman came out here to look at the power of my house. He said, everything's fine. I said, then explain these graphs to me. And I held him in his face, and he was like, well... And I said, I'm telling you, it's not my house. It's y'all. It's your problem. But the controller helped me figure out the problem to resolve it. And, he really didn't think it was their problem. He was sure it was on my side. And it was, he actually blamed the box where the meter is mounted, like that box itself. He goes, that box is the wrong size and you need a bigger one. And I thought, it came with the house. How can it be the wrong size? And it connects to the other side, which is my breaker panel. They're kind of a team. So that was his answer. And I refused to accept that. And about a week later, I was still having problems. And I mean, there was weird stuff going on. It wasn't just the tank, but the tank was tracking it. And the other tank was tracking it. I had the information from the Apex and the hydros backing up that something was wrong with electricity. And I mean, I had weird stuff going on to where, I'd turn on, or the lights were on in the room and they'd flicker down and then they'd rise back up. Or I would be microwaving something and you could hear the microwave slow down and then speed up again. And then there was the washing machine changed resonances. You could just hear it. Like it wasn't running at the right power. Something was really wrong. And finally, they fixed it. And it was nothing to do with my house. And it was, a few blocks away. And they found whatever the hell was wrong. And they resolved it. And then my Apex gear, my Hydros gear, everything reported good numbers again. The little exclamation marks went away. I mean, how do you predict something like that happening? If you had a problem with your aquarium, you'd think it's your aquarium. It's your pump. It's your light. But it was the city power. But I was using my controller to kind of help me identify what the heck was going on. So anyway, that's my spiel when it comes to controllers. I think they're super practical. There is an upfront cost, but you can buy one used. People are getting out of the hobby, they're quitting, and they can say, I've got this used setup, and you can look at it and you can say, maybe I'll just buy this at half price and hook that up to my tank and replace a few things that are bad and not have to spend quite as much. Oh, and then lastly, with the controller, which I didn't mention, I talked about a lot of the stuff on my screen here, you also have the ability to turn things on and off from your phone, even when you're out of town. So, like, for example, my house is a smart home to some degree. It's not super smart, but for example, when my tank sitter had a problem getting into the house, I could use my phone and I could unlock the front door for him from where I was. And then he got inside and did what he had to do. And so having that ability, and I also had the ability to turn things off remotely. When he said, hey, there's a problem with such and such, I could just go ahead and I could disable it. Like I could just turn off the protein skimmer entirely for my duration because there was something not quite right. And rather than making him troubleshoot the problem, I just turned it off for the time being because I'll be home in a couple more days. All right. Part of your routine maintenance should be water test Saturday. I've been preaching this for a long time. Caitlin said it best. She said water tests save lives. And so I do always remind you that. I actually show it to you at the end of every show. There it is right there. That's her own artwork that she designed. And so anyway, I always emphasize that water testing is so important. And if you're not testing your water frequently, you will have problems with your corals. And water testing is, the basis for everything. If you have a swimming pool or you have a hot tub, you test that water too before you get in because you don't want to get sick. And if it's fine, but then later on it's not fine, you take a sample in to have it tested, like at the pool place, and say, can you check this because my eyes are burning or my lungs hurt or whatever, and you kind of identify if there's something physically wrong with the water itself. It's the exact same thing with your aquarium, with your fish and your corals, and they need really good water because it's a closed ecosystem. They don't have the whole ocean to bring them better water and take away the bad, so to speak. You just don't have that. You have, this tank here, it's 1 gallon. That one there, it's 20 gallons. My Reef, 400. Caitlin's 27. But each one has its own filtration. And if you're not staying on top of it to make sure the filters are running right, then your water quality will go down. And if you're not testing, you don't know that your water quality is going down, but you are watching corals looking less healthy. They're either less vibrant, they're receding, they're not growing, they're dying. I mean, there's so many things that can go wrong. But if you're doing everything right, if you're being super proactive when it comes to staying on top of things, all those things I mentioned won't happen to your corals. They will be colorful. They will grow well. They will thrive. They won't die. So, stay on top of that. It's really, really important. And then temperature is something that I don't think enough people worry about. I talk about it on this channel quite a bit. I talk about the safety of using 2 heaters instead of 1 that are at half the rated wattage, so you can't cook your tank. And yet every single year I come across thread after thread about someone saying my tank was 97, my tank got to 101. I was like, how can that even happen? And it's because they bought like dual 800-watt heaters for their 55-gallon aquarium. And I was like, oh. So here's the thing. 2 heaters is correct, but the wattage is critical that you get it correct also. And what I'm saying is that if you say, well, I want 2 heaters, so if one fails, the other one still works, that's the wrong state of mind. It's okay to have a backup heater in a closet, in a bucket, in a box, in case your heater dies so you can throw it away and plug in a good one. That's fine. But the wattage of your heater, 3 watts per gallon. That's my rule. If you find in your area you need 5 watts per gallon, if that's the truth for you, that's fine too, but know the number. But for example, if you had let's just say a 55-gallon aquarium, and we're using my math at 3 watts per gallon, that means you need 165 watts to help warm up the water when it gets too cold. If your 55-gallon needed 5 watts per gallon, you would need 275 watts to warm the water and keep it warm enough because it's so cold in your house or it's winter, whatever. And, the basement's too cold where your tank is. Those kind of things, those rules, you have to figure that out. But we want to know the watts per gallon, and then we want to divide that across 2 heaters. So if I needed 275 watts of heat, because I need 5 watts per gallon for my 55-gallon aquarium, I would need 2 137.5 watt heaters. Now, there's no such thing. But you could get 2 125 watt heaters, and you'd be really close to where you need to be with a combination of 250 watts. That right there is a good, safe way to maintain an aquarium. If your heater sticks in the on position, it will be a low burn. It's like simmering. It's just trying to warm the water. For both heaters to get stuck in the on position is really unique and unheard of. Normally, if a heater fails, it either fails one way, on or off. Either it never comes on again or it stays on and never turns off. That's it. But if it's at half the wattage of what your tank needs, it can't overheat the tank. You may see a slight increase. You might say, hey, my tank's always 76, and for the last couple of days it's been 78, which is kind of weird. And you look down at the heater and you're like, oh, okay, and there should be a light on the front to give you an indication. But if the next day it's 79 and the next day it's 80, you're like, okay, clearly something's wrong with my heater. I need to unplug it and inspect it or replace it. But if you had an 800 watt heater in a 55-gallon aquarium, that's 14.54 watts per gallon, 15 watts per gallon. My client in New York had a heater that failed. His tank was getting a little too cool. I think the tank was down to 74 degrees and he was worried. And so he just grabbed a handy heater, which was 800 watts, and he plugged it into his Apex. And as soon as he did that, the Apex module put a little exclamation mark and a triangle saying, warning, you're using too much power. I mean, that's what it means. And he said, I have to plug it in. I don't have a choice. I said, no, don't use that heater. It's way too big. And he just said, it's what I have. I got to use it, Mark. And I said, unplug it because you're going to destroy the outlet on your EB832, which is the energy bar for the Apex system. Every outlet on a power strip has a limit. If you use a common, I usually have these things laying around me, but I don't today. If you just use a common 6-way power strip, just a long beige looking thing with a cord that's 6 feet long, it has an on-off switch, and it's got 6 outlets, That whole strip has a maximum of 15 amps almost always. Sometimes you can find one that's rated for 20 amps. That means if you plug in an 800 watt heater into one outlet, you're already using 8 amps right there. And then you add your lights, and you add your pumps, and you add your this, and you combine it, you could go beyond the 15 amps. If you have two 800 watt heaters, you're at 16 amps on a 15 amp power strip with 4 outlets still available that you think are perfectly fine to use, because as long as there's something to plug in, I'm going to use it. And that kind of attitude can cook your tank. It can start a fire. The cord itself can get too hot. It may trip the little reset button in the power strip. It may trip the breaker. It may not. It may just smolder until it burns and catches on fire. And then your carpet catches on fire. And then the side of your stand catches on fire. And then eventually the tank bursts because of the heat. And the water puts the fire out if you're lucky. And you just have a scorched wall. So instead, never use more power than you should that your product can handle. So in his situation, I told him, if you have to use that 800 watt heater, because that's all you've got until you can get a new one, which he was ordering another one from Amazon immediately, which is fine, but he was worried about right now. I said, get a thick extension cord, like not those little lamp ones that people like to use. Get the orange one, the long one, plug it into a totally different room, and run it to that heater and put that in your sump, and at least you've got the heat to keep an eye on the temperature of the tank. So he did, and he had the Apex to tell him the temperature of the tank. But now the Apex could no longer control it because it was plugged into a totally different room. That right there was the scenario he was living with. And the next day he calls me up and he says, Mark, my tank's way too hot. I said, I know, because you used much too big a heater and you plugged into another room and the Apex can't turn it on and off. So he says, well, man, you were right. I'm like, I know. And so he contacted an employee at his office and he says, please unplug that extension cord and stop the addition of heat to the tank. All right, so now I went on and on about heat. The same thing happens with cooling. Your tank may be getting too hot. The tank may be getting too cold. There's all kinds of things you can do, but one of the things I really like to have as a visual indicator in my house, and I did this for a long time. I don't need to do it anymore, but back in the day, it was the best thing in the world. It was called the Big Temp Alert. And if you look that up on Amazon, it's probably $20. It's a big display that hangs up on the wall with a super long wire. And it's got 2 numbers on it. I will hold this up to the camera so you can see it. This is the display. And right there, oh, dang it, hang on, let me go back. I found a way to show my slides on the show. I'll just do this the whole time. Oh, that's the wrong, that's not the Big Temp Alert. That's hilarious. That was a blood pressure measurement. That was an internal joke I had that I shared in that presentation. But the Big Temp Alert, you hang it on the wall and it's got 2 numbers. The top number is the temperature of the room. The bottom number is the temperature of the probe that comes off the meter, which I would stick in my tank. And, once you learned to quit looking at the wrong number, it was great because, the numbers are this tall and you can see from across the room, my tank is getting too warm. My tank is getting too cold. And why would my tank have a change of temperature? Well, I had heaters, but I didn't put a chiller on there. Instead, especially in the winter, I could crack the door open to the garage that was behind my aquarium and let the cold air come in because my garage was chilly. And so it would just let the heat from the room kind of flow in the garage. The cold air came in through the door being open a couple inches. But if I had to go to work, I would then see on my phone that my tank is getting too cold and I'd have to yell at my kid and say, would you please get off the sofa, stop playing that game, and close the door to the garage? I told you to keep an eye on this. That was my temperature control system back in the day. A lot has changed since then. Now everything's perfect. But back then, my kid was part of the situation, part of my solution to a problem. I'm just cracking up at this blood pressure measurement that's on my screen this whole time. All right. Now, another problem that people tend to complain about is that the sound of the aquarium is too loud, and they want solutions to it. Now, there's a lot of different things that can make sound. The number one thing would be the water draining from the tank into the sump. That one there is one of those situations where you've got to dial it in. You've got to find the correct sweet spot to make it less noisy. And one of the quickest, easiest ways is to slow the flow rate, pushing water back up to the tank, because if it goes up slowly, it's going to drain slowly. If you're pushing up really fast, and when I'm saying slowly and fast, I'm talking about gallons per hour. If you're pushing up at 10,000 gallons an hour, you're going to have Niagara Falls coming down in the sump. If you're pushing up at 300 gallons an hour, you're going to trickle down at a quiet rate. But if you go too slowly, the benefits of your filtration will reduce. They will weaken or be non-effective. I guess that's the better way to describe it. The water going through the sump is moving so slowly that the skimmer has nothing to remove. So the skimmer is bubbling, but it's not doing anything, and it's just waiting for the next few drops of dirty water. Okay? Doesn't work. If you have a heater in the sump and the flow rate is going super slow, the temperature in the sump might be perfect while the temperature in the tank is much cooler because the probe that measures the temperature is in the sump. So the heater and the sump, they're working perfectly, but your water is going up so slowly that the tank is cooler than the bottom. If you have the same flow rate through the system, if you have a steady flow rate is what I'm trying to say, then the temperature of both the sump and the display should be the same. Okay? So make sure that that is the case. Let me close this. That's the one thing that makes a sound. The second thing is the skimmer. There are skimmers on the market that just boil away and they're pretty noisy. There are other skimmers on the market that are nice and quiet. I love my Nio skimmer. Because of it, I bought myself a second one for my other system. And then when my main one, after 7 or 8 years, had pump failures, I just bought a new Nio skimmer. I didn't go to another brand because I love how quiet it is. I basically can't hear it at all. The another sound that you might hear that you don't like is the return pump is vibrating in the sump, and it's creating this sound that only stops when you turn the pump off. If you ever have a pump like that, there's a couple of tricks. One trick would be to actually mount the pump in a way where it's kind of hanging off the plumbing, where it doesn't touch the bottom of the sump at all. It's just hovering a half an inch off the bottom, and that will avoid any kind of vibrational issues. There are pumps on the market, Suche's one, that has rubber feet that dampen any kind of sound effect. Others have used, it's a rubber type of space age material that you can use in the kitchen to pick up pots and pans, the pot holders. And this rubber is completely food grade and safe, and you could put that under the pump and set it on top, and that will absorb the vibrations. But it could even be the pump itself is vibrating through the PVC pipe. It's causing a resonance. So in those situations, and if you're running an external pump, this is also true, the plumbing that goes from the sump to the external pump, or the plumbing that goes from the return pump up to the tank, you might need a section of Spaflex tubing instead of rigid PVC, because it'll absorb a little vibration and get rid of that resonance. So that's what I've done in the past with where I had situations with plumbing. Whenever I did an external pump, I always used Spaflex, which is a bendy type of tubing. It's very, very rigid, but it's bendy. It has a little bit of give to it. Rigid PVC is rigid. It's like a snare drum. You tap it, it's gonna make a sound. So having that in that spot could help to reduce the sound. If you're using vinyl tubing, then you already have no problems with sounds usually. But again, look at where everything is and where it's touching. And sometimes just moving that tubing off of the edge of the sump or tethering it in a way where it can't make contact with something else could be the solution to making it quieter. And then the pumps themselves that move the water in the display tank, those pumps may be noisy because of their design. Or it could be because they're misaligned. Or it could be because they're dirty or defective. If there's a mechanical issue with the pump, resolve that. Get a new impeller, get a new propeller, replace what's cracked and broken, and suddenly it becomes quiet again. In the case of the Vortec pumps, you've got the wet side, you've got the dry side, and if they're slightly out of alignment, there's kind of a sound effect. But if you line them up perfectly, they become dead silent. But if you are programming it to do something like wave mode, the pump is going to be going through a cycle over and over and over where it is ramping up and cooling down, ramping up and cooling. I mean, it's doing it every 3 seconds, like every 2 seconds, maybe every 1 second. I don't know. It's really quick, and you're going to hear that. You're going to hear it from across the room. You're going to hear it through your entire house. I don't use wave mode. I don't like wave mode. I find that wave mode, just to have the water do this in my tank, is pointless, and we know for a fact that tanks that have a wave action, it reduces the lifespan of the aquarium itself. So if you didn't like buying a brand new tank and you really didn't like hauling it into your house and getting it up on the stand, you're really not going to like having to replace it with another one because you used wave action that wore out the seams of your tank and the tank now needs to be replaced. So rather than getting a tank that was rated for 10 years and you have to replace it at 8, don't run wave mode. That's my suggestion. But if you like it, then your tank will last less long and you're going to hear the sound from the wave making machine. But if you're using something like reef crest or lagoon mode or steady flow, those types of sounds you don't hear. They become ambient noise and they usually become very, very low. My own reef tank, which is big, as you know, 400 gallons, I don't hear anything but the water chopping at the surface because of my random flow generators. Those nozzles that are penductors, basically, but then the water doesn't just come out at a high flow rate, but it comes out in one of 5 different random locations. So it shoots up, shoots down, shoots sideways, shoots down, shoots down, shoots down, shoots up, shoots sideways, shoots straight. That's what it does. And it makes the water on the top of my tank kind of churn and boil a little bit. And so it kind of sounds a little bit like a babbling brook. But I don't hear my drains, I don't hear my vortex, I don't hear my skimmer, I don't hear the water in the sump. All that's dead silent. It's just the water lapping at the surface. And if I wanted to change that, I would just change those nozzles, point them down slightly, and make it a little less noisy. And to be honest, I need to pull them off and clean them anyway, because that will also make sure that the water is flowing out of the nozzles cleanly and not getting caught on like a bubble algae that would kind of help make ricochet it upward a little too high up to break the surface. The fact that my water is churning the way it is right now is creating a lot of salt creep along the top of the tank, which makes me have to clean it off on a regular basis. So I actually do need to spend some really serious time with the 400 gallon to get it on track. Here's a So this video is not too old. It's probably about 6 months ago. The tank looks a little bit different from this point right here. But what you're looking at, you can see there's flow in the tank where there are things to move. And then, of course, all those rigid things that don't wiggle, they're not going to do anything. But the tank itself needs a lot of work, and I've got a lot to do in my near future. I can't ignore it forever. I got to stay on top of it. But those are some of the things when it comes to sound. There was another pump on the market, the Neptune Systems Wave Pump. I never heard of this from any other brand of pump, but apparently when you'd install that pump in your tank, depending where the power cord went up, you'd hear the pump. I was like, what? And it's like, no, it's true. If you just adjust that cord, Dwayne was telling me about it, you just kind of figure out where the sweet spot is for the power cord, you don't hear the sound. And I was like, wow, I've never been aware of that one before. Okay, and then finally, if the sound of your tank is too loud because you are having company over and it's dinner, it's a birthday party, whatever, and you just don't want to have that, or it's in your bedroom, you're trying to go to sleep, the final thing you can do is use a timer to turn off the noisy piece of equipment that's bothering you until you can fall asleep, and then have it resume while you're slumbering. So for example, let's say your protein skimmer is just this noisy little beast that irritates you. You could set the timer to turn it off at, let's say you go to bed at 10. You could have it turn off at 10, or you could turn it off at 9:50, and then have it turn back on at 11. And that way you go to bed, you've got your book out, you're getting ready to doze off, you go to sleep, and then while you slumber, the skimmer comes back on and starts doing its job again. That's another method that can work. If you have a controller, you can program it, or you can push a button and you can just say disable for this many minutes. So there's another reason why you should get a controller. All right. A problem that a lot of people talk about is algae. And I think it's kind of funny because here I just put some in that tank. And I was thinking how the rule has been for so long, do not let algae get in your tank. Don't put that macroalgae in your tank. What are you, crazy? It's going to take over the tank and ruin it. Well, it depends on the tank, first of all. It depends on your ultimate goal of what you're trying to do. There are certain algae that will infest a tank, and it will be a battle to get rid of it. Hair algae is something people hate. Bryopsis is something people hate. Valonia is something people hate. Technically, they hate all the algae. But if you are trying to get algae under control in your tank, it's doable. And the first attack is going to be you. manually removing the bulk of it. I mean, that's the first step. The second thing is going to be for you to put in a nice, healthy cleanup crew. Brand new cleanup crew. Hungry creatures that are starving and can't wait to mow down anything that lives. And they will go through and they'll pick it clean. I put in a little tiny cleanup crew in that tank right there. That tank was hideous a few months ago. It was so bad I didn't even take a before picture because it was just disgusting. And now I kind of wish I had, just to show you the difference, because it was night and day. And they did it in so little time. I mean, that's a 1 gallon tank. And I put in 3 margaritas, 2 bumblebees, and 3 hermit crabs. And they picked it clean. I mean, even the barnacle itself, that thing was just covered in hair algae and red slime algae, and they picked it all clean. And now it's all pretty. Here, I'll show you guys a picture of it. Well, actually, I probably could zoom in on that. Let's see if this camera will play nice today. We'll see. We'll do this. I gotta do one more thing here really quick. Let me change something here. Change that to that. And there you go. And now we'll zoom in again. I remember the other day I was trying to do this and it wouldn't focus. And I was like, why I want to do it? And I figured out last night why. So we'll go down here. Trying to get this thing in the middle. It's always the opposite of what I think it is. Okay. A little bit more, a little bit more. Now, obviously, you can't see it well enough to see the Blenny. He may be in the back right now. But it's nice and clean. So, just want to let you know. Let's see. I'll change this again. Oh, I'm out of the frame. Get back in there. Oh, the other way. The other way. It's always the opposite. I actually think it's always the opposite. I mean, like literally, doesn't matter what I pick, the computer always pick the opposite. I think it's going to be. It's rude that way. So, but if you can clean up your tank on that level, it'll take care of the algae problem you don't like. But another thing you need to do is to blow off the rock work. You can use a turkey baster if the tank is small. You can use a power head if it's larger, so it's not so exhausting to clean. And you just point at the power head, and you've got it on a long extension cord, and you just work your way through the rock work and get all that detritus kicked up. And let all that stuff go down into the filtration, whether it's a sump with a filter sock or filter fleece, or if it's an all-in-one tank and you have sponge pads in the back. But you just want to capture as much as you can. Also, while you're blowing off everything, that's a great time to do a water change and pump out a lot of murky water and put in nice clean water and kind of lower the level of detritus in your system. I don't recommend brushing and scrubbing things because usually when you do that, you end up spreading it everywhere. So if you were like brushing off the algae in the tank because you don't like it, it's all over your toothbrush. But there's also stuff blowing around everywhere, and it's going to land somewhere else and glue back on and grow again, and now it's in a worse area than it was the first time. So I always recommend pinching it off and throwing it away. I always recommend lowering the phosphate level in the tank when it comes to algae. If you have algae growing, your tank has phosphate. And if your test kit says you have none, but you have a tank full of hair algae, rip out a bunch of algae manually, and 20 minutes later, test your phosphates again, and I guarantee you it will not measure 0. So lowering phosphates, my method is Phosphate RX. It's a great problem solver. I just keep waiting for them to come up with a product called Nitrate RX. I would love that. Phosphate RX is a flocculant. It just is adding lanthanum to the system, which transforms the phosphate into a solid so it can be exported in a fine micron filter sock or even just pulled out through the protein skimmer. And it's a great product that I've been using now for over 15 years. And then finally, if you have a tank full of algae and you're just so frustrated and I told you I could fix it for $300, would you say yes? And you'd probably say, oh my God, yes, please do it. Here's the $300. And I would just buy you a cleanup crew and put it in the tank. So just add more critters. Just let them do it. This is what they live for. And if you have some cleanup crew and they're not doing it, those are the lazy ones. I'm not saying get rid of them, but don't count on them because they're not doing the job. But you get brand new hungry ones. And when you think about it, when you buy the new ones, they're picked clean. Their shells are clean. They're not covered in algae because they're all looking for any scrap of food while they're waiting for someone to buy them. And you get those in your tank and they're going to go to work immediately. And you can put them where you need them. You can take it off the snail off the glass and put them right in the patch of algae and say, this is what I want you to mow down. Okay, another thing that it is a problem for people and they hate is they will say, I started my tank with dry sand, I started it with dry rock, I dip every single coral, I quarantine every fish, and yet how did I get such and such? It could be aptasia, flatworms, bristleworms, asterinas, vermitids, mahanos, tubeworms, limpets. Just all these weird things just seem to appear in your tank despite your best efforts to have the most sterile reef tank ever. These creatures are actually not your enemy. Most of them are not. Some of them are a nuisance, and I understand you not wanting to have them. Acropora eating flatworms? Yeah, that's a terrible one. They're going to eat your acropora. That's a problem. Aptasia are not really a problem other than they sting things and they're not pretty. If they were bubble tip anemones, you probably wouldn't even care. But they're not. They're glass anemones. They're not nice to look at. They tend to grow into massive colonies. So yes, we kill them off, and the best product on the market is F. aptasia. So I recommend it to everyone. My friend Frank invented it a few years ago and sells it by the truckload to companies across the world. So if you are looking for a solution, that is the one. I've used it myself a few times on some problematic aptasia, and they went away completely. They did not come back later. Matter of fact, I was looking in Caitlin's reef here really closely a couple days ago. I haven't seen an aptasia in that tank for over, I'd say 15 months, and I think I spotted one for the first time. I was like, I've got one more to hunt down. But I'm going to catch it while it's 1 and not while it's 20. If you have a tank filled with aptasia, you do not want to kill them all in the same session because you're going to create a chemical imbalance in the aquarium that will be toxic to your livestock and start risking their life. So we would only work on a section of the tank each week, for example, and that way the water column can adapt and adjust in the filtration and remove the toxins that you've just added to the tank. So you're not overloading the system. If you were saying, well, I want to kill every one of those 1,000 aptasia today, that would be a terrible mistake. But if you want to work on 100 of them today, and then you work on another 100 in a week, and another, you will get ahead of them. And in a month from now, you might have 0. So just take your time. Don't overdo it. Vermitids are a problem that they cast a web in the tank, and they can irritate your corals. But other than that, it's just a worm that's snacking on food it catches on its web. And you can break off the tubes. You can seal the hole with glue. You can buy bumblebee snails and hope that they eat them. You can maybe get lucky and some kind of fish will chomp through their shells and eat what's within. But, it's just a thing that happens, and they come in with your corals, whether you like it or not. You can dip these corals, you can inspect these corals, you can cut off their frag plugs, and you will still end up with a chitin or with a keyhole limpet or whatever. I think my top-off container is empty. Let me turn this off. That's the first time that's happened in a long time. Okay. Water box. Off. How nice is that? I have a controller. I didn't have to jump out of my seat. Another problem that people have been running into a lot for the last couple of years is that their tanks are so low in nitrate and phosphate that they end up with dinoflagellates. And that is why they came out on the market. It's crazy. 20 years ago, you would never been able to buy this. You would have been laughed out of the fish store. But now you can buy bottles of nitrate and phosphate to pour in your tank to raise the levels to get them up where they need to be. Then where they need to be, nitrate, 20 ppm or less, okay? So if your tank is 1 or 2 or 3, yes, that's a nice, cool goal. But if it's 20, it's okay. If it's 0, not so great. So, and a new tank will be low numbers, just so you know. Don't freak out. But if you're in a situation where you're trying to get that nice ionically balanced water, the problem solution is to add a concoction of nitrate or phosphate to increase these numbers a little bit to get the right levels to get that perfect balance. If your tank is deficient in these numbers, besides the dinoflagellates, you're going to have corals that are not going to look as healthy because they're lacking part of what they need for a successful growth. With phosphate, anything under 0.1 is perfectly fine. Don't be scared of phosphate. Richard Ross has a beautiful tank, stunning tank, packed with corals. his phosphate is regularly over 1.0 ppm. He doesn't care about phosphate at all. Me, I try to keep it somewhere between 0.1 and 0.75. Just depends. Like right now, my tank is 0.4, and I'll just dose some stuff to get it to come back down again, and I'll get it back down to like 0.13, and I'll be perfectly fine with that. The lower the phosphate in my tank, the less algae I see growing on the glass. And of course, where does it come from? A lack of water changes, abundant feedings, tank is 11 and a half years old, the deep sand bed has a lot of waste in it. I mean, there's a lot of sources of my phosphate woes, but as I start working on the tank to re-establish it back to where it needs to be and reset it to something reasonable and improve flow and cleaned up my filtration and inspect my, everything, then it'll all be a lot easier to maintain. And it's just, right now, to be really perfectly honest, I know what needs to be done, and it will not be pleasant, and my back already hurts thinking about it. And I know it's on some level, it's actually overwhelming. And so it's why I keep focusing on the little tanks right now. Let me get them squared away. Let me make sure they're perfect before I touch the big one. But the big one needs a lot of help right now. And I've got to just finally commit to getting my hands wet and doing it. And I think I might have mentioned this last week, and I was hoping during this week I'd have the time, but I didn't. But and tomorrow I'm going to Reefapalooza, so I won't have time tomorrow either. But I really want to just pump all the water out of my frag tank, scrape it clean, and get some new water in there and start taking things out of my reef and putting them in that tank just to start the process. And but I don't know. I can think of 5 things I need to do today, more than that. So the overwhelming job to do continues to be overwhelming, but I'll get to it when I do. All right. Okay. A problem that some people run into is protein skimmers, and I've got multiple videos on this subject, so I'll only talk about it briefly. But the number one thing would be that the water level that the skimmer is sitting in has to be the exact same height all the time, no matter what. That's why when you install a sump, there should be a skimmer section with a set height that never varies. That skimmer section should be whatever it is. It might be 12 inches, it might be 6 inches, it might be 8. The sumps I build for my customers, it's at 9 inches because 9 inches works for most skimmers. But if the skimmer needs to sit in something shallower and my sump is built to 9 inches high, I will then make a skimmer stand to put in that section to put the skimmer upon and get the skimmer to the right depth. So for example, let's say I was using a reef octopus skimmer. It wants to be in 4 inches of water. My skimmer section is 9 inches deep. I would make a 5-inch skimmer stand to lift the skimmer up to 4 inches, and the skimmer will work perfectly. Why does it matter about the water height? Because the cone that makes up the body of the skimmer, whether it's a cylinder or a wine glass shape, as soon as you put the skimmer into the sump, the water level will rise to the depth of the section that the skimmer is in. So if I take my brand new skimmer out of the box and I put it in 9 inches of water, the body will be 9 inches of water full already before I've even plugged it in. Then I plug it in, the pump starts sucking in water and it's mixing in air bubbles, and immediately it tries to volcano, and I open the valve on the back as much as I can to make as much water pour out of the body, but it's still sitting in 9 inches of water and it won't operate correctly. If the manufacturer says it has to be at 4 inches to 5 inches, that is the sweet spot. And it's got to be in 4 to 5 inches of water, because then when the pump comes on and the air mixes in, it's going to push it all the way up to the neck, and then it's going to collect the waste in the cup, but hopefully not just a bunch of watery water. We don't want to just remove water for the purpose of that. We want to remove waste. And so we want the skimmer to be operating properly. It needs to be in a set, fixed level of water. If you just have an aquarium under the tank with no baffles and the water level is just whatever it is, and then let's say you don't top it off regularly. Let's say you top it off manually, and you do this every 6 or 7 days, or when you hear the pump sucking in air, you're like I just did now with the top off, right? I heard it going, so I turned it off. If you are sitting there saying, I only add water to the sump when my return pump is drawing air, then you're going to dump in a bunch of water, and you're probably not going to put in a certain amount. You're going to empty the jug. And now your skimmer might be sitting in 2 additional inches of water, so now the skimmer wants to overflow because it's in too much water. So we want to make sure that the water level is the right height. The way to avoid this problem is to have an auto top-off system, and they're cheap. There's stuff on as cheap as $40 on Amazon There's nicer ones that are like $100. There's super nice ones that are going to cost you $200-$300, and they will keep that water line in your sump the same height every single day, no matter what, as long as your reservoir, like mine, is full of water. So my rule of thumb is to always refill my reservoirs on Monday. And for whatever reason, I didn't do it this Monday, and that's why that little bucket ran out prematurely. It didn't make it to Monday. But I've already got my jug that I used to refill that bucket. It's filled with water. I did that earlier this week, so I'll just pour that in and I'll be good to go. But having the water level fixed in the sump will be one very important step to dialing your protein skimmer and make sure it works correctly. A lot of times people will say, I plugged in my skimmer and it didn't work. And I'm like, all right, so let's figure out what's going on. If your protein skimmer was installed on a brand new system, you bought a tank, you bought a sump, you bought bags of sand, you bought dry rock, and you put all of that together and you put your skimmer in and you turned it on and the skimmer's not working, it's because everything's too clean. There's nothing for it to pull out. There's no waste. There might be some sediment from the sandbags, and yeah, so it might capture some of that, but there's no dissolved organic compounds because there's no organics in your tank. And if you're starting with bags of sand that have an additive to give you bacteria, you don't want to run the skimmer anyway. It's a brand new system. So look, let me just jump ahead here. Spoiler alert. You set up a brand new tank and you have to cycle it. Do not plug in the skimmer for the first month, okay? Don't turn on the lights. Don't turn on the skimmer. Just let the water go through the system. If you want to use filter socks to capture the sediment so the water becomes clear more rapidly, totally fine. Don't run the lights. Why? Because the lights will grow algae. No lights during the cycle, no filtration during the cycle. We don't run carbon, we don't run GFO, we don't run the skimmer, we don't run anything. No UV, nothing. It's just water moving in a circle, waiting for the, and you're gonna have to do something, but you're gonna go through the ammonia, nitrate cycle, and as it goes through that entire process, it will then complete itself, usually in about 21 days. After the 21 days, now you introduce your first fish because you want to see if it'll live. Hopefully it does. And at that point, you are putting in a little flake food for the one fish, and that one fish is going to poop a little bit. You still don't need the skimmer yet, okay? There's still no reason to do it. Right now, we're just trying to establish a bacteria in the tank, and every single time your little tiny fish poops a little bit, it provides a little bit more food for the current total volume of bacteria in your tank. Let's just say you have 1 million bacteria and you add the fish and you feed the fish and the fish poops and now you have 1.1 million bacteria. And then you're like, oh, things are going well. I'm going to buy another fish. And you put it in and you're feeding in twice as much food as before because now you have 2 mouths to feed. You got 2 fish pooping and now your bacteria is 1.6 million. And this is how you grow this, establish a system. Those 2 fish are not going to pollute your tank to where you need a protein skimmer yet. But once you start to have a bioload, once you start adding corals and they're stress sliming into the water column, you've added some fish, you've got some cleanup crew, at that point you can turn on your protein skimmer. And I'm going to tell you right now, and people will debate me left and right, and I don't care, they're all wrong. Protein skimmers do not need to break in. I have never installed a skimmer on any system that didn't start skimming within the hour. It absolutely works because I'm always setting up tanks that are running. And what I'm saying is, like, for example, I moved that tank in New York a couple weeks ago, and I took I took everything out, and I moved it to a new apartment, and I put brand new sand in, and I added 100 gallons of brand new water, and then I used all the used water I had left. I put in all the rock from the old tank, I put in all the corals and all the fish, and I added more water to the sump, and then I turned on the skimmer, and the skimmer was skimming. Okay? Now, that was a used skimmer. You might say, well, Mark, that was already broken in. All right, let's take my 400 gallon. I had a 8-year-old protein skimmer from Nios, and I could not get the replacement pumps, and the only solution I had was to buy a new skimmer to get those pumps. And I hated it, but I had been waiting to get those pumps for 3 months, and I couldn't get them. What I really needed was the impellers, and I couldn't get them. I tried everything. I tried to get them at Interzoo while I was in Germany, and couldn't get them there because of things went wrong. So I finally just caved in and bought a new skimmer. I put it into my sump, and within the hour, it was skimming. Then I had a Nios skimmer under the frag system, and a company reached out to me that's no longer in business. I did a review about their skimmer, and I liked the skimmer. And I put it in the sump. I plugged it in, I adjusted it. Within the hour, it was skimming. Skimmers work when there's something in the water column. Putting a new skimmer in a new system with no life, it's not going to work. And then you're like, well, yeah, it took weeks to break in. I was like, no, it did not. It took you weeks to get enough life in there to create a little bit of DOC, which is dissolved organic compounds, so that the protein skimmer had something to remove. All right, another problem with the protein skimmer, and this happened to the New York client, his skimmer was not doing a good job initially when we just pulled it out and, put it in a trash can and moved it, right? When we got to the destination, we put it into the sump. We added the right water line, the right water level into the sump. Everything's ready. Plugged it in, and it wasn't doing a good job. And I pulled out the intake tube that has the Venturi nozzle, and it was encrusted with salt. So I told Kyle, grab a tool, grab a matching drill bit from this kit of drill bits that we had with us. I said, just put it in the hole and twist and carve out the salt creep, which he did. And then we put it back in, skimmer started skimming immediately. So if the Venturi is obstructed, you need to carve out the calcified salt that has obstructed the hole so that air can get into the skimmer. If your bubbles in your skimmer are not looking sort of like milk, your skimmer is not getting enough air. Also, the client had turned down the knob on the top of the silencer. It's a weird little silencer, so it's got a couple of things on it, but there's this knob, and you can twist it all the way down. I don't know why you would ever twist it down, but he had it all the way down. So I just opened it all the way up so it could suck air in properly to get air into the body, to create the foam, to make the bubbles, to do its job. And once those tiny adjustments were made, it was solved. Also, when you're trying to figure out the adjustment on the protein skimmer to get the water line the correct depth in the body while it's running, and I'm not talking about, you've got your set depth in the sump. That's done. We've got it on a skimmer stand. It's at the right depth. But now there's a knob on the top or on the side that you adjust slightly to adjust the water line in the skimmer. And what I usually do is, if the collection cup's on top, I like to bring it to where the bubbles are boiling right here at the base of the cup. That's where I always have it set, and it works great. If you have it boiling way down here, it's going to take a long time for stuff to rise up and get in the cup. If you have it way up to here, it's going to want to overflow really quickly when some weird thing happens in the tank. So better to always have the water boiling at the base of the cup itself. So here's your cup right here. You've got the neck, the wine bottle shape coming up, and you can see some acrylic here. Just get the bubbles to bubble right about here and don't worry about it. If it ends up that the cup fills up too much, you lower it down a little bit. If it's just not pulling enough waste, bring it up slightly higher. But it's a slight adjustment. And that adjustment is just like when you're in the shower and you're like, oh, it's not quite hot enough. Do you twist the hot and go on? No, you just do a slight twist because you don't want to fry your skin. Same thing, slight adjustment, see what the skimmer does, stand back, watch, slight adjustment again. It's never going to be a big twist. So don't do that. The skimmer's too noisy. It could be that it's vibrating. Again, the rubber mat, the silicone mat underneath might be the solution. It could be that the pump is not installed properly. It could be that the pump is dangling. It just depends on the protein skimmer. But there's always a way to figure out a way to make that skimmer be nice and quiet. And then finally, if nothing works, maybe it's just a POS, and you know what that stands for. Just buy a better skimmer. Okay, fish disease is another problem that a lot of people run into. All I can do is tell you, like I always do, I'm not a fish disease guy. I don't have any solutions or cures for you. My solution is to send you to Humble Fish. He is the guy that helps everyone across the nation. He's got a team of people helping, and he has a bunch of articles. Just go to humble.fish and hit enter on your keyboard, or in your browser on your phone. Humble.fish, and then go. That's it. Go to that website, and you'll get answers. And if you can't find the answers, he's got a forum on there, and you can post pictures of what's going on. You might be able to attach videos, and that way they can help you identify exactly what's happening, so that way you can alleviate the problem that's going on with your livestock. But odds are, if you have a fish disease problem, you're probably going to need a hospital tank. You'll probably need certain medications. You'll need to spend a lot of time helping them. Just like when we get sick and we end up in the hospital and you got 10 people taking care of you, same principle. It's not going to be one of those things where you can be passive. You're going to have to do a lot. But you can help that fish recover. Another problem, quote unquote, is my corals aren't growing. And I only say that facetiously because corals grow at different speeds. Soft corals grow abundantly. That's why soft corals are great for brand new people in the hobby. It just fills the tank and it's got motion and you love it. And then, you start trying other things. You're like, these stupid soft corals are everywhere. And so, like, for example, you get an LPS coral. Maybe you get a scolie, or you get a frog spawn, or you get a torch. Well, those take a long time to grow. They are not quick. They are not going to fill up a tank like zinnia or mushrooms. It's got one stalk and it's got a head on top. And if you're lucky and everything goes well and you do a good job and you maintain stability, you might see a bubble appear in that head of that coral, that polyp, and that means it is splitting into two heads. But it's still one stalk. You're not going to get 10 stalks. It's going to take a while for that to split. And now you got two polyps coming out, two large polyp stonies. And then at some point, this one will make a bubble. And then maybe later, this one will do it. And now you've got 4 heads all on one stalk. Okay? But then at some point, you will say, hey, I actually have a colony now. I don't just have a single torch. And at that point, you might put it through a bandsaw, which is a wet saw we buy for our aquariums, to carefully cut off the base so that we have this beautiful bouquet without the big, long, single stalk at the bottom that's so hard to place in your tank. So that's something to keep in mind. SPS corals grow at different rates, and I have had some that grow like gangbusters, and I've had others that I'd put the frag in there, and a year from now, it was the same frag. It hadn't done a damn thing, and I was, just annoyed as could be. But at the same time, sometimes you're just like, you know what? Whatever. I don't care if you ever grow. And that actually works. Try that with your corals. Sometimes you just have to berate them and they feel guilty and they start growing. And I've done that. I've done it where I was like, I don't care if you live or die. And then suddenly it started growing. It's like, oh, all right. So negative reinforcement does help sometimes. But sometimes it's going to be a matter of moving it to a different location because it does not like where it is. Maybe not enough light, maybe not enough flow, maybe stung by the neighbor to the point where it won't grow and it's just in survival mode. But when you find the sweet spot for each coral in your tank, those corals will continue to grow and they will fill in beautifully. And you may still have some stragglers that barely grow at all and you're like, ugh. And it's like, but, like for example, I bought something called frog skin from ORA. It's an SPS, it's an acro. And it kind of, the stick never became more than itself, but it grew along the base and kind of puddled on the rock. And I was like, all right, eventually it's going to be something. And then, of course, other things outgrew it. It was in the shade and it just died. And that was that. It just depends. Certain corals are going to be known to grow quicker. If you are a Montipora lover, like I am, Montipora capricornis is the one that plates. There is Undosa that encrusts. And then there is digitata that makes sticks. And those sticks do grow very rapidly, but they break really easily. If they break off, you can either plant that piece that broke off elsewhere in the tank, or you can put it back within the cluster to encourage more of a colony look. And I've done that. When I had a piece, I'm using the cleaning magnet, I snap off a twig, I put the twig back into the group. It's like, all right, you guys are friends, I'll leave you all together. But, almost everything on my list here I said, other than be more patient. That is one thing. You might say they're not growing, but maybe they are. Maybe they're growing slower than you thought they'd grow. Like you were thinking, oh, in 9 months, my tank will be full. That's usually not the case. SPS corals will grow, and if you start with something the size of a fist, you could have a nice little colony 9 months from now. If you put in something, the size of a twig, it's going to be a long time before you have something nice to look at. It takes a while to go from twig to fist size when you think about that. And then, you go from fist size to something beautiful, and, a couple of years later, and your tank's really, really pretty. So patience is key. But, of course, that involves that, stability of the water, good flow, the right amount of light at the right intensity, and keeping your hands out of the tank for the most of the time. And then maybe, could it be a lack of food? Could it be you were like, well, I heard they like pristine water, so I never put anything in there, but I feed my fish every other day so I don't ruin the water. Like, you're making a big mistake. Feed your fish. The fish in nature are eating all day long to stay alive. And in your tank, if you're feeding them once a day, which is a logical thing to do, you could. If you wanted to feed more frequently, you can use smaller portions. So let's say you're putting in an egg's worth of food a day. If I wanted to feed 10 times, imagine this egg sliced into 10 equal portions. Then I could put it in every hour for 10 hours, but I still only did one egg. Now, if you're going to put in 10 of these a day, you're going to have a problem with algae. So, kind of keep it within constraints. But if you do want to feed more frequently, you can. But try to avoid the whole, I only feed my tank a couple of times because I don't want the glass to get dirty, or I don't want the phosphates to go up, or I'm worried about nitrates. Like, no, filtration is there for a reason, to keep up with the demand. Be reasonable. When you feed your tank, the general rule has always been and still is, when you put the food in the tank, if it's gone within 2 minutes, you did not overfeed. If it's gone in 20 seconds, you might be underfeeding. And you definitely want to make sure that everyone in your tank is healthy. You want your fish to be nice and thick and healthy. I feel like skinny, starved fish are more prone to have disease issues and health issues. So, making sure that you're feeding is enough. But now that you've fed the fish and they're nice and plump, they're going to poop in your tank and your corals are going to eat it. So the corals are getting some food. So if you're not feeding the fish adequately, you could be starving the corals and you're not getting the growth you're anticipating. Then there's other products like Benereef. Benereef is a great food that you can use a lot. You can very frequently use it in your tank. It does not create problems like nitrate and phosphate. And you can mix it up with a cup of water. You can use tank water and wait 5 minutes, activate the bacteria that's within it because it comes that way, and then you pour it into the tank. It's called broadcast feeding, and all those little polyps on the SPS corals will get a snack, and you're feeding your reef. So that could be part of why your corals aren't growing enough. It could be that the lights you have are not as good as you think they are, even though the Amazon ad, the Chinese seller swore they're the best lights for a reef tank, but they may not be. You might need a par meter to verify that you're actually getting adequate light. Like, for example, I'm at Reef Stock. I went to Clam Mania. He has all these beautiful clams. And I said, well, I really don't want to put one in the reef because I have a butterfly and I feel like it's going to eat it. And then I thought, maybe I could do Caitlin's reef. But then I just got the lemon peel. So that might not work. And then I thought, well, maybe I could put it in this little tank here with the blenny. The blenny won't hurt it. And he said, Mark, is there any chance that light on that 1 gallon tank is putting out 200 par? I was like, no. He's like, no, you can't put a clam in that tank. But that would be the perfect tank because it's small. It could be right in the front, but I need to measure the par on it. So I will. I'll check the par. But it's probably going to be something really, really weak. The only upside is it's white light versus blue light. Blue light has less par. So maybe there's some, but it's not going to support a clam. But it will definitely support the growth of that green algae. And that green algae, I'm sidetracking here, the green algae growing in there will help with some of the filtration and adding some oxygen to the tank too. So there is some benefits to it, to making that little tank, that blenny tank, a nice little ecosystem with a little bit more to look at. But so that leaves me with one tank left for the clam, and that's the one behind me. And actually, I think it's a great spot. So when I go to Reefapalooza tomorrow, I might come home with a clam, and that'll be super exciting because I haven't had one in a super long time. All right. Okay, another problem that some people run into and they say I'm unhappy with and I want it to be better is that they might say that the corals look bad. And now that is a very vague statement, so here are my list of things that could be affecting it. And here, I'll just hold it up for it. Here's my slide, y'all. Okay. I really would like to get this resolved for the next time I do a live stream. Are they pale? Are they white? Are they retracted? Or are they just stagnant in growth? Is that what you mean by bad? Or are they covered in algae? Is that why they're bad? Like my gorgonian that was in Caitlin's reef. Beautiful coral with yellow tissue and red spots and white polyps, and something's covered in hair algae. And I don't know if you guys saw it, but I did a little video where I took airline tubing and I held it down next to the coral and I just vacuumed the coral branches clean one at a time. It was super tedious, but the algae didn't hold on. It just it peeled off. It was the craziest thing ever. I did not think that was going to be a thing, and I was able to completely clean off that coral, and all the polyps emerged again. It was beautiful. So, what are we talking about when you say the corals look bad? If the corals are pale, it could be a lack of nutrients in the system. They just aren't getting what they need, and that could be trace elements. That could be food. I mean, it could just be the coral is starving of something. It could be that it's getting way too much light or it's not getting nearly enough light. Everything in this hobby is about finding that sweet spot, that balance point, and making adjustments for each animal in your exhibit to the point where it will thrive and not just survive. So if you have a coral that's pale, why is it pale? Is it getting cooked with light to where it's bleaching? Or is it in a spot that's being shaded by a huge colony above it and it's bleaching? There's that. Did you buy it bleached and it's going to take a while to color up because it lost its zooxanthellae within itself? That's a thing that can happen too. And, like for example, you could buy an LPS coral like a hammer or a frog spawn, and then one day you just see this brown, like stringy stuff coming out of its mouth, and it's like this wispy thing. And that is when it's expelling the excess zooxanthellae that's within itself. And that right there is, it's excess. It's okay. But if it expels it all, because the tank got too hot, the tank got up to 90 degrees accidentally, or 95 degrees, and it sheds it all, then the coral in your tank will have to survive off feeding alone until it can regain that symbiotic algae within its tissue and regain its color. Back in the day, a lot of people bought bleached anemones. They'd put them in their tank and like, look, it's so cool. It's like a pastel blue, a pastel pink, a pastel white. Is that a thing? And whereas like, no, that's a bleached anemone. That thing needs food. And you would leave it in your tank and 6 months later, 9 months later, it actually darkened and got more robust because the symbiotic algae within was back to its proper level. So that could be, again, and another thing can bleach corals. You go on vacation and you tell your tank sitter, hey, I only want the lights to be on for this many hours. And they come in and they turn on the light. They hit the button on there and they feed your tank and they look at it and they leave. And they don't turn off the light. And the tank light just stays on 24 hours a day. And they come back the next day and they feed the tank and they look at the fish and they leave. And then they come back the next day and the light never turns off. You're in 48 hours, 72 hours, 84 hours, 96 hours. And next thing you know, you come home, everything's bleached and there's algae everywhere. And you're like, oh my God, what just happened? Had you installed a mechanical timer on your light, you would not have had to ask the person babysitting your tank to turn the lights on or off ever. They should not. And if for some reason they have to come at a time of day when the lights are not on, tell them you don't need to worry about the lights. Just turn on the light in the room. Turn on the ambient lighting. That's fine. The fish will see the food, put the food in the tank, and leave. Don't touch my tank. And that will avoid that type of bleaching that can happen when someone leaves something. The corals might look bad because you have chosen certain fish that nip on the coral. And of course the coral won't survive if it's being constantly picked on. And that, when you think of that term, picked on, that's funny. It fits both ways. I had a client who had this problem, kept buying lots of really pretty fish that were not good with coral. And then all the corals he got kept getting chewed up. And he was like, what is the deal? Like, stop buying those fish. You're literally mixing the wrong things together. And once he started using reef safe fish and was more judicious in his purchases, the corals that he had did much better, and they turned around and improved. And then finally, if the corals look bad, it could be there's a conflict between neighboring corals. It could be they're fighting during the late night hours while you're asleep, and you're completely oblivious to it, and they're stinging the crap out of each other. They're burning each other. They're reaching out and they're saying to their neighbor, "I will kill you." That is a thing that can happen with certain corals. So really, is it the whole tank the corals don't look good? Or is it really you have 3 corals that you're really freaking out about, but there's 27 that are totally fine? You have to kind of bring that up into conversation as well. And then another problem, and this is more of a personal beef I have with humans, is when they say such and such is trash. And, that's something new. It's the vernacular now. And, I know what they're trying to say, but at the same time, it's a very specific term, and it bothers me. Because let's say, for example, you're a Windows user, and I'm a Mac user, and I show you, hey, I use this mouse to control my computer. And you're like, that Apple mouse is trash. So you're disparaging the entire product line and the product itself, and you're saying it's garbage. And rather than just tell me, here's a much better mouse for your Mac. You could tell me that. But that negative connotation, it allows other people to interpret that, and they automatically assume, oh, it's not good. I should never have bought that. Why did I buy that? I made a big mistake. I'm not going to say a word. And they're assuming that their product that they purchased was bad. There are bad products on the market. There absolutely are. Not everything's perfect. And I'm pretty picky at what I buy, right? But at the same time, is it something that the user is using incorrectly, or is the product physically bad? Is it something that you could reach out to the manufacturer and talk to them because it's under warranty and figure out what you're doing wrong as the hobbyist? Because sometimes user error is the dominant reason why something isn't working correctly. It could be just never read the instructions. It could be didn't install it properly. It could be installed it incorrectly. I mean, one thing. One's like, literally, I'm doing it this way. I don't care what they say. That's another whole argument right there. But ultimately, when we're putting things together in the aquarium, we want to do it in a way to where it's going to have the best chance for success. You spent the money on the product. Now let's implement the product the best way possible to get the best chances of success out of it. When you're online looking at commentary such as "this is trash" or whatever, read the rest of the comments, because you might see other people chime in saying, "Hey, actually, I found this great solution to making that product do the best it possibly could, so I didn't waste my money." And you might find some solutions that way. So just because the product you got didn't work and the manufacturer couldn't solve your problem, maybe others that use the same product have figured out a solution and it will work for them. And then, of course, taking care of your product so that it's in good shape. I mean, let's say you're using the gyre and you've got that inside your aquarium making lots of flow, and then now it's not, and you're like, why isn't there any flow? Well, when's the last time you cleaned it? And once you do clean it, oh my God, I have so much flow. And there was a time where I went to a guy's house. I was watching his tank while he was out of town, and I was looking at everything. I'm just there, and I'm me, and I'm a problem solver. And I looked at his pumps, and they were all really dirty. And I spent hours cleaning each pump one at a time over my 2 or 3 visits until he came home. And when I was done, everything was nice. And he calls me up when he gets home. He goes, "What'd you do to my tank?" I was like, "What do you mean?" And he's like, "The sand is everywhere." I was like, "I cleaned your pumps?" And he's like, "You shouldn't have done that. Now I have a big problem with my sand bed." I'm like, "You wanted dirty pumps that don't move water?" And he was like, "Well, I mean, and I was like, "You're supposed to be saying thank you for doing that for me since I never do it. And instead you're yelling at me because your sand bed moved? Turn them down." Which all you had to do is open the cabinet door and turn the knob slightly. That's it. It wasn't like, now that I've cleaned his tank, he will never have a sand bed again. It was so crazy. All right. And then, of course, being prepared for things going wrong is another big chunk of problem solving. So if you have a tank leak, for example, how are we doing on time? Yeah. Let's say your tank is leaking. Do you have anything to deal with a leak? Are you prepared in any form or fashion? Do you have a container that can hold water? Do you have a shop vac to clean off the carpet or the floor where the water is, or a mop bucket? Do you have tubing and pumps? Do you have emergency gear that you could hook up in the container to hold your livestock because your tank is leaking? These are things that you should be asking yourself. It's fine to buy an aquarium and buy a stand and buy a skimmer and a sump and lights and test kits and a thermometer and a hydrometer. So you do that, but something is going to fail at some point. And if you have nothing in your back pocket for when things break, you're doing a disservice to the animals you're caring for. So you should definitely have something. And a long time ago, there was a guy in our club, and he was selling a 100-gallon Rubbermaid trough. And I said, "I'll take it." And it sits in my backyard. And I have lent it out to different people for their emergencies and then got it back. And when my tank sprung a leak, guess who pulled his 100-gallon trough into the fish room and drained all the water into that and put animals into it? I mean, having that was great. Trying to put all your livestock into a series of 5-gallon buckets is much harder. It's not impossible. It's doable. But each body of water is now its own aquarium. They all need a heater. They all need a power head or an air stone. They all need to be individually tested. They all need to be individually topped off. It's a whole disaster. So, best case scenario, you have a 200-gallon aquarium, you have a 200-gallon backup aquarium. No one does that. I don't even do that. But that would be the perfect backup scenario. Tank's leaking? Great. I got that backup tank in my back room. I'm going to take this one down. I'm going to put that one on the stand. I'm going to put the livestock in. I'll be done in 8 hours. Perfect. That would be sweet. But having vessels to put all your livestock in is one thing. Having another huge trash can or barrel to hold all your rock would be another thing. So what are you going to do with all that sand? And then, of course, if you have a controller, the beauty of it is you can take all those probes and put them in the temporary vessel to keep track of pH and temperature to enable the heaters to turn on and off. You might be able to rig up a top-off system onto it, maybe, depending how it's made, what it's built out of, and that way it keeps the salinity all the same. That would be sweet. But if you have multiple vessels, you can't use a controller like that because each vessel is independent. You would have to basically plumb them all together, and that's a whole other craziness I wouldn't recommend. And then, of course, in an emergency, having a bottle of Prime is so important because you can add a capful per 50 gallons. You can use it at double or even triple strength in an emergency to lock up ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, chlorine, chloramine, and all the evils. It's fantastic stuff. And putting that inside anything that has livestock during a crisis is smart. You can put it in the tank that's leaking. You can put it in the vessel where you're moving the livestock. You can put the tank a week later. That same thing to kind of keep things okay. And then, of course, having fans to dry the floor would be good. Big floor fans are cheap. Renting them is expensive. Go to Harbor Freight and buy yourself a couple of floor fans, and you can dry out your own carpeting yourself instead of spending top dollar. Tons of towels would be great to have as well for an emergency. And, I don't know. If you have a spouse that's really picky about her towels, you better have your own pile for when you flood your living room. And then another emergency that you want to be prepared for, problem solving, what this presentation is today about emergencies, and we talk about the tank leak, but the other thing is power outage. So if you do have a power outage, what do you have in place to keep your tank running? Do you have a power inverter? Do you have a generator? Do you have battery backup? Do you have a automatic airstone bubbler like the one I showed you guys last week from Two Little Fishies? That's called Lifesaver. This little guy here is going to run these two tanks next to me. I haven't hooked it up yet, but it's coming. It's one thing at a time. But yeah, having that there will help to keep your livestock alive while the tank is in distress. But that's just power. Then what if the pump fails? Do you have a backup pump to swap out in case it fails? What if something spills in the tank? Not just your normal stuff. Like you might spill the test kit vial into the tank. You might spill a jar of fish food in the tank. You might spill some alkalinity into the tank because you bumped the jar. But what if your child pours something in the tank, like Dawn or hand sanitizer or something your child can reach, and they think they're being helpful? They're doing what daddy or mommy does, and they just put something in. Are you prepared for that? Do you know what to do? Are you protecting against that type of potential damage? That's the whole part about being prepared. You kind of try to outwit Murphy, so that way Murphy's Law doesn't strike. Do you know what to do if you do spot disease or a pest in your aquarium? Do you know where to go, who to ask when there's something that's unusual to you before you kill it? Not everything is evil. And then finally, do you have a plan of action? So, I already mentioned you should have extra gear on hand. If you've been in the hobby for a long time, you tend to have a lot of extra gear. I have tons of gear in my house, way too much, because I throw away nothing. And usually my biggest problem is finding where I put it. And no matter how much I try to keep it organized, it constantly gets lost again. I spent 10 minutes walking in circles in this house yesterday looking for my glass cleaner for the aquariums, because I have the Fritz glass cleaner and I like it. And I don't have to worry about it getting any chemicals in the water. And I walked into the fish room. I walked through the living room. I just used it recently. I looked under the, I thought maybe I took it off the coffee table and put it under the coffee table. It wasn't there either. I looked near where all my test kits are. It wasn't there. I went back to the fish room again. I went to the studio in case I cleaned something off out there. Finally, I found it in the cabinet under Caitlin's reef. I was like, ah. And, that was great because Jack knew I was looking for something. She was all worried about me because I seemed to be stressed. But I found it. But the better organized you are at putting everything away, the easier you can find it when you need it in an emergency, when there's a crisis. And when things break, if you know where you keep all your backup gear, you're going to be one step ahead in resolving the problem. When it comes to avoiding problem parasites, do you dip all the corals that you get? Or do you have the products? Do you do it? Or do you just buy things and stick them in your tank because your buddy said it's safe and it's fine? Don't trust your buddy. Do not trust your favorite fish store either. Everything you buy, you should dip it. We want to dip it. We want to inspect it. We want to look for any kind of problems. And then if it looks good, put it in our aquarium. If you just take things from other people and put them in your tank because they say it's clean, you are risking finding something later on that will be a little harder to remove. So it's best to just always dip. And then do you have the products to dose what your tank is lacking? And this sounds really basic, but I have had so many people over the years say, I have a problem with my tank. And so we say, do a water change. He goes, oh, I'm out of salt. No, you're out of what? The one thing your tank is based on is salt. I understand you run out of stuff, but you should have more quickly, especially when there's a crisis. If your tank is leaking and you got to make a bunch of salt water to put your livestock in a separate tank that's perfectly good, and you have no salt, what are you going to do? I mean, it depends how bad the leak was. If you can get used water, move it over, great. But if it's all over the floor, you're not going to be siphoning that up with a shop vac and pouring it into the tank and then grabbing fish off the carpet and throwing them in the tank. I mean, you're just not going to do it. So whatever you can do, try to have the things you need in your inventory at home. Definitely you want to have all the test kits, but you should definitely own, which is a weird one for a lot of people who've been in the hobby a long time, you should own an ammonia test kit. A lot of us are thinking, I haven't tested ammonia in 20 years. But when something goes wrong and you're trying to save your livestock, that's when ammonia will happen. If the rock was exposed to air too long, if you moved a lot of livestock, there's a chance ammonia will rise. You could have a little tiny rise. And the prime I mentioned earlier will help lock it up, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. Still, if you have an ammonia test kit, you can verify. When you're trying to protect against power problems, it's great to own a generator or the power inverter or the things I talked about. But where are they? And are they easy to start? Are they, like for example, Chris was talking to me yesterday and he said he could not start his generator and his tank was that power for 5 hours and running and he was just freaking out. And he was talking about, do I buy this one or buy that one? Talking about new generators. And I kept saying, we got to be able to fix what you have. You need a Bobby. Bobby would fix this. He would tell you what's wrong. He'd tell you what to unscrew. So anyway, he finally got it running and got his tank running and got the heaters going and everything was good. But, if you own a generator, are you running it once a month to make sure it runs correctly? A lot of us don't, myself included. I just don't think about it. I mean, for me to pull it out and turn it on and plug something in to put a draw on it, it's a lot of effort. And it's not a priority until it's a priority. And then it's like, oh my God, will you start or not? And you start freaking out in your head. But if you have the generator and you're testing it regularly, then on the day of a crisis, it should be good to go. But then where do you keep your extension cords? Where do you keep your plug splitters? Where do you keep this? Where do you keep that? If you have them all together in a bin like I do, I can go to that bin and grab all the cords I need, all my orange 3-way splitters and whatever it is I need. I got them in one spot. I know where they are. That's what I'm emphasizing. Just have a plan of action, Having buckets and bins and troughs and barrels, the more you have, the better. I know they can be cumbersome. They can be clutter. They could be taking up space in your home. If you have a spot where you can put them, that would be great because when you need them, you really need them. And then having a huge batch of salt water that's new and ready to go is great. The reason I have a 250-gallon poly tank behind my 400-gallon reef is that if there's a big disaster, which has happened to me a couple of times, I had well over 100, sometimes up to 200 gallons of new salt water ready to go that I could use immediately. I didn't have to start making water and then add salt and wait for it to clear before I could use it. I have salt water ready to go at all times. And that was something I learned from Steve Wiest. He had something terrible go wrong and most of his tank just went down the drain, like literally physically down a drain to where the tank was mostly empty. And he thought, oh my God, he came back from dinner and he said, well, my tank is really mature. It's very robust. I'm just going to use tap water and get water into the system. And he ended up having lost a lot of livestock. It did not work. So when he told that story, my brain immediately said, I need a monster container of salt water as my backup. So when my 400 gallons sprung a leak in 2012, after being 13 months old, I remember I had to set up multiple systems to hold on my livestock, and having all that salt water at the ready was the perfect solution. I wasn't in a panic. And then, of course, call a friend. If you're in the middle of a crisis, if you can get a friend to come over, great. If you can't, call the fish store, see if they can send an employee over. Call a maintenance company, see if they can come over. Get someone, even if it costs you some money, to help you through the crisis. You don't have to be Superman. You might want to be Superman, that's okay. But if you need help, ask for help, because sometimes there are certain things you just can't do by yourself. So that is everything I had to talk about. That was it. This is the final slide. So, all right. Let's, hopefully I can get that iPad start talking to the software again like it used to. Super annoying. Let me go ahead and look at your questions and see what I missed here. Because I could see quite a bit was happening in the chat. All right. Nature bats last. I don't know how to say that. It says, I'm curious on your words and advice for an established 20-gallon system with coral only. I'm skimming and using a 10-gallon sump. I have a small cleanup crew, but I'm curious about feeding. Well, it's established, so the tank is in good shape, and you have some filtration, the protein skimmer, which is ideal, and you've got a cleanup crew. So it just, when I talked about feeding earlier, maybe I addressed this a little bit, maybe I did not, but if you are putting in food that's consumed within 2 minutes, you're doing a good job. Feeding daily is the best bet, but it depends on the fish you buy. It's a small tank, so you're probably not going crazy with a fish load. But for example, if you said, well, I ended up getting a bunch of anthias, they need to be fed frequently, several times a day, 3 times minimum, 5 times a day. It would be a terrible choice for a 20-gallon tank. But a smaller tank like that, water changes will be your friend, because it is the best export for keeping the water parameters in check. I'd love to see this tank. If you're a member of Club Milo's Reef, go ahead and post a picture in the group for me so I can see it. Richard does not like controllers like I do. He says they offer the ability to overanalyze something, making you number chase till your hair falls out. So yeah. There could be stress. You're looking at the stuff, you're like, oh my God, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. At the same time, no matter what the controller is telling you, also look at the reef tank itself and see how the animals are acting. Because you don't want to overreact in the other direction. Just because you see some terrible numbers on your app doesn't necessarily mean your tank is dying. But it could be these are several things you need to work on. And then you have to choose which ones are priorities and work your way down the list. Many years ago, I had to go to the walk-in emergency clinic, and I went there with a list, and I put them on my phone so I wouldn't forget. And when the doctor finally came into the little room, he said, so what do you need today? And I said, I got a list. And he's like, he looks at it and he goes, you get to pick 3. And I was thinking, man, I'm paying you like $100 for this visit. I want the whole list. And he's like, you get 3. So I had to prioritize. I had to choose what were the 3 top things that bothered me for the day. So I told him, and he did it. And then I was a little upset when I left and the other 4 things were ignored. But it is good to know what's going on. But I also don't live and breathe my controller. You know what? I use it as a tool. Just like I use a hammer as a tool. Just like, whatever. So how often do I use a hammer? Do I walk around with a hammer every single day? Do I wear it on a tool belt on my hip at all times? No. But when I need a hammer, I know where to get it, and I use it, and I do the job, and I put it away. Same thing goes with the controller. I open it up when I need to see something, and then I close it up. I don't live in it. And there are some people that I swear they open theirs 50 to 100 times a day, and they're constantly looking at it, or they're constantly adjusting something, or they're constantly adapting something, or they're constantly enabling or disabling something. And it's like, what are you doing? Why? What on earth does your tank need you to do 50 times a day? Nothing. If you want to know the temperature of your tank and every time you open it, just look at the temperature, all right, you're being super cautious. Great. But if, I've just seen threads in the past where people would post, I can't do anything in this. It's never working. I'm like, how often are you opening it? Because each time I open the app, it works. I do it. I set it to auto, or I set it to on, or I set it to off, or I see some numbers. I'm not running into these problems. And I just, like you said, you're overanalyzing and you're freaking out and you're constantly looking at it. And I just don't. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm not married to my phone like some people are. I don't know. Rather Be Traveling says, speaking of testing, have you heard any updates on the Hydros Maven? I haven't heard anything. I mean, I see people still asking, when's it coming out and why hasn't it come out yet? And I feel like I'm just watching the exact same thing that happened when the Trident was announced but wasn't out yet, and everyone just kept begging to release it already. What's taking so long? It's vaporware. It's fake. It's all a lie. It's like, it's the exact same thing. And CoralView did the exact same thing. They released something as a preview to get everyone excited, but it took longer to produce than they expected. And so now they're getting the exact same treatment that Neptune Systems got, 5 years before. Nick says, how can I lower magnesium in my reef? I don't know. I would say that it will just dissipate on its own. Stop adding any more would be one thing. But, like, for example, when I used to use a brand of salt called Cybon, every bag of salt mix was 1,600 ppm. So for 3 years, my tank was 1,600 ppm, and I couldn't budge it a bit. My Montipora soaked it up, and it stayed 1,600, and every single water change kept it there. The only solution was for me to use a different brand of salt that had a lower amount, but I had so much of it, I just kept using it till it was gone. And then when I switched, I think I went from that to, I think it was Red Sea Pro Reef, which was a red bucket, if I remember correctly, or a red lid. And I used that, and it had a lower number. And then I had to dose magnesium. And then I used Aquavitro Salinity for about 5 or 6 years. And that one I needed to dose some magnesium. And now I've been using Fritz for like the last 2 years, I guess. Year and a half, 2 years. And my magnesium was kind of up there. I haven't dosed magnesium in my tank in a couple of months. It's time to fill up the jug today and let it start trickling in again, the little bit it needs. But generally, I think the only way to lower magnesium would be to use a different brand of salt mix that has a lower magnesium level. So how do you know? Well, mix up your current salt mix and do a magnesium test and see what the number is in your brand new bucket of salt water and see what it is. And then, if you're like, well, I really don't like that, I want a lower number, then it is. But what you didn't say is you didn't say what your number was. If it's 1,400 or below, 1,300 to 1,400, that is a pretty sweet spot for me. If it's 1,200, it's too low, it needs to come up. Generally speaking, whatever your calcium level is, your magnesium should be 3 times that number. So if your calcium's 400, your magnesium should be 1,200. If your calcium's 450, you gotta be 1,350. That's where the number is. But if your number is like 1,600, 1,700, 1,800, and then finally, could it be that your test kit is incorrect and you're getting a false number? So double check too before you make any changes. And lastly, how is your livestock doing? Are all your snails frozen in place and not able to move? Then yes, your magnesium level is too high. If your snails are still going about their business like normal, then maybe the test kit is incorrect. But ultimately, I don't know the answer because I don't know what your magnesium level is. PK asked a question, and I have no idea what he asked. Maybe some of you guys were able to interpret this. He said, can you please talk about Lyngbya, how it appears and how to eliminate it safely? Lyngbya, Lyngbya. I don't know. Maybe let's type that one out again if you're still here. Nick says, what is the relationship between calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium? How the levels affect each other? It's a very important relationship. And the expert on this topic is Randy Holmes Farley, in my opinion. He wrote a great article about this in reefkeeping.com. So I would tell you to go to Google and find his article, specifically Randy Holmes Farley, Holmes, Holmes dash Farley. And he wrote multiple articles on water chemistry, and he explained it. And in my brain, the one thing I remembered the most from his huge write-up, multiple pages, he had a graph with numbers down the side and numbers across the bottom, and then he had these dots representing various elements, and they had a box, sort of like home plate, where the home run is counted in baseball. And everything had to be over home plate. And that's what stuck with me forever. And I knew as long as all my parameters are inside that box and nothing is down here and nothing's up here, I'm good. And so that is where I learned the most when it came to that. But for me to explain the chemistry specifically, I might do it a disservice. So I'd rather point you to the source that helped me back in the day. But like I mentioned before, alkaline and calcium, those two are the basis of a reef tank, and they're the basis of coral growth. Okay, so you got carbonate, and you've got calcium carbonate, and you've got see, I hate doing this stuff on camera because I have to think it through. But alkalinity is key for coral growth. Calcium is what the corals use to grow. We had a fantastic issue of Coral Magazine called Everlasting Stony Corals, and it actually went into this stuff super deeply with like these amazing formulas that we verified that the formulas were correct. And it explained how on a cellular level, how there are membranes within the cells that would keep stuff on one side of the membrane, but let certain things go through to the other side to grow a new cell that would make the building blocks that becomes the calcification that allows the coral skeleton to grow, that the tissue is completely encasing. I mean, it's like the human body. We have this skin over a skeleton, and there's muscle that allows us to move the body around, but inside that are organs, but inside that are the cells, and it all comes in. It's fascinating. This was a really good issue, and if you don't have this, it's available on my website for purchase. Just go to the Corals magazine section. And by the way, the latest issue is on my website, but it does not show up in the group with all the magazines, and I have no idea why. I looked at it a dozen times. It makes no sense. But if you type Coral in the search box, you can find the latest issue, or any of these issues. These are $10 each. They're fantastic books for you to learn from. Shipping is $6. So for $16, you could get that. But calcium, alkaline, and magnesium, the trifecta, combined with temperature and salinity, are where you're going to get ideal coral growth, where you're going to keep and maintain healthy fish. And when anything is out of the box, that are not over home plate, that's when things go wrong. And that's why it's so important that we keep them all within range. That's why we do the weekly water testing. So I hope I didn't dodge your question, because that was not my intention. The Dry Reef says, how would you calibrate a temperature probe? I never have, but I'm sure there is a way to do it. There might even be a task in Fusion for doing that. But you're not going to temperature calibration to freezing water. Like to ice water, you don't do it to that. You would want to do it to a known factor, something that's closer to the temperature of our aquarium. So like, for example, let's say you had a glass thermometer that you trusted and you put the probe with it. You could then go into Fusion and probably put in the correct number you say it is to then believe the probe. Or you can just go with what the probe says. I tend to just accept what the probe says. I haven't looked at my settings in forever. Let me take a look really quick and see if there's anything here that springs to mind under heater, or sorry, under temperature. Let me check here. I mean, I'm pretty certain I have auto temperature compensation turned on in Fusion somewhere. But there is an option to calibrate, but I can't remember ever having to do that. So my answer is Andre says, what are your thoughts on mechanical filtration? I'm thinking about switching from filter socks to sponges and bags of crushed coral and maybe some filter floss. Okay, so mechanical filtration is really, really important in our systems, and that's why people are using filter socks, or nowadays they're using fleece rollers to trap the particulates blowing through the tank. I myself don't use any of those. I let the stuff just flow through the tank, and I consider everything that's flotsam and jetsam that's moving through the water column is potentially food for something in my system. Whether it's a coral, or a fish, or a worm, or a vermitid, or a stomatella, whatever, something's going to consume it. And then if it just settles out and just, becomes dust or detritus on the bottom of the sump, I can pump that out. If you're trying to have a pristine sump, catching every drop of water in a filter sock is going to keep your sump nice and clean. But there are people that have given presentations on why you should leave an inch of detritus in your sump. And I was like, what is she saying? Wow, I would never do that. So once a year, I clean out my sump of all decay, of all the crap that's just settled into the bottom of the sump. I just pump it out one way or another. I have a nozzle that goes onto a power head, and I can pump it out into a bucket, or I can just pull out the shop vac and really remove it. Or I can be a little different and grab a bowl and submerge it into the sump, and then I grab a credit card and I carefully scoop under the pile and take the credit card with a pile of crap and pour it in the bowl, and I kind of gather it in a bowl, and I lift the bowl out of the sump and I throw it away. So mechanical filtration will help to trap that kind of stuff so it doesn't settle out. But you're saying, I feel like maybe you have an all-in-one tank. I don't know why I think that, but maybe an all-in-one tank that has one of those racks in the back with different slots for different things, because you mentioned bags of this and bags of that. So crushed coral usually isn't a great choice for our aquariums for saltwater. It used to be used back in the 70s and 80s, and it's really a spot where nitrate can gather, and crushed coral is not good for some of our fish, like the ones that want to sleep in the substrate. Wrasses would get scratched and torn up diving into a hard crushed coral substrate. But if you're talking about bags of it, then they're either in a canister filter or they're in an all-in-one bag in the back. That's a different thing. It's just not great. But having even these tanks here, both of them have a little filter floss pad in them to catch waste. And every single week I take the pad out, throw it away, and put a new one in there. And it just helps to kind of keep the water clear. Jeremy says, best way to battle low pH when I'm having a party at my house. You could hook up an air stone to an air pump with a long piece of tubing, so the air pump is outside and it's pumping fresh air into your aquarium. That's one method. You could raise the alkalinity and the pH of the tank before the party to bring it up a little bit higher, or you could dose a little pH buffer during your party. You could take out 10 minutes and just kind of buffer it up to 8.3 once or twice. Normally your tank's okay, but I don't know what kind of a rager you're throwing or how long it's going to be. But I've had my house filled with like 12 or 15 people, and I didn't worry about a thing. So it just depends what you're doing and how long you're doing it. But you definitely could buffer during their visit and just kind of bump it up a little bit. That's the simplest solution. It's funny, Rather Be Traveling says this, and their name is Rather Be Traveling. I travel out of the country for a month at a time. 2 years ago, a hair algae problem. 6 months to fix it. This year, I come back to vermitid snails from adding a new cleanup crew. You're just going to have to stay home and work on your tank. Rhomba first says, I really miss when you used to do a lot of your videos in front of your large aquarium. I enjoy these. Wish you'd make more that way, but it's all good. I stopped doing that because of the effort involved in setup. It was, like at the very beginning of the show, when I do my little video clip showing the setup, that took about 20 minutes to stage, and then the tank didn't look good in the background because the camera was focused on me and the background just looked bad. The webcam was never good. I got frustrated with it, and eventually I started using my DSLR, and I got a better look, but it wasn't great. It was just And then I started doing some videos in the studio, and you also didn't like that either because I didn't show you the tank. So I set up this office where I have 2 tanks behind me, and I'm trying to give you a little something aquatic related, but I can't please everyone. I get it. But to be honest, my tank has just not looked that great. I'm not happy with it. It's all right, And I'm sure people out there would say, I'd die to have that type of tank. I'm not happy with it, and that's why I want to go in there elbows deep and start doing a deep clean. And I'd like to get Dwayne out here to help me do it. I'd like to just fly him out and hang out and work on my tank and make it pretty again. And it's just so much nicer with a helper. And, Dwayne is, I don't know if you guys saw, but he's been on this show before. He helped me during Markna, and he's helped me with my resets twice. And he just announced after 20 years that he is done, and he is taking down his reef tank. And last weekend, he got up and down the ladder for multiple hours as 4 different people came over to take corals, and his back was killing him for 2 days. So can you imagine him, if that happened with his own tank, getting him to fly out here and help me with mine might be a hard convince, but he does enjoy hanging out. So I'm hoping he'll do it, and I would love to do it with him because we're buddies, and we've been friends for so long. It's sad that he's taking down his tank. I'm very disappointed in him. I almost unfriended him. And of course, that's all a lie, and he's still my friend. Let's see. Team Kentucky Outdoor says, I have a 20-gallon long with an anemone and 2 clownfish and a green cabbage leather with no skimmer, just a canister filter for over 6 months already with no issues. That's great. I'm glad to hear it. Mina says, I noticed a few weeks ago that you use Prime. I understand what it's used for, but I always thought it was for freshwater. What's your purpose for using it? Prime has been around for a long time, and it's made for salt or freshwater. It works for both, and it's great in an emergency, and it's also great as a pre-treatment for tap water. So if you're using tap water to make salt water, at least using Prime helps to dechlorinate the water to make it a little bit safer. But everyone should know by this point that we don't use tap water, and we use RODI water, which is going to strip out all the bad stuff and get us down to pure, zero TDS, zero total dissolved solids water. But then, even then, a few years ago, Texas was in a really bad drought, and I could tell that the city was doing something to the water. I just knew. I just knew it. I can't remember how I knew it, but I knew it. And so my RODI would pump into my reservoir under the reef, and then I added Prime to that reservoir every single week, and my tank did not skip a beat. And I brought it up to Frank and said, hey, I've been doing this. He goes, I have too. So as he was making new batches of salt water with his RODI system that he sold water to his customers, he was putting Prime in all that water, and so his systems and his client systems were not having problems. But those that were just running RODI were having problems with their tanks. That Prime was a nice extra safety net that you should use when things are weird, when there's an emergency, or like I said, when there's a drought. The city is actually adding extra chemicals to make the water safe for consumption, and that stuff is usually not safe for reef tanks. KCTB says, do the oils from your hands and body greatly affect the chemistry of the aquarium? It absolutely does. That's why it's always good to wash your hands first. And then, of course, every time you reach in your tank and you're done, you should go wash your hands again to rinse them clean of anything that came from your tank. If you have cuts or open wounds on your hands, that is not the time to reach in your tank whatsoever. And if you have to reach in, even though you have a cut, make sure you wash your hands very carefully with soap and water when you're done to avoid any kind of bacterial infection that you could get from your aquarium, because that is a real thing. Something to keep in mind. Edward says, I just came back from Reefapalooza, got a clam from Clam Mania with my copper band. I don't know if this is going to work out. Well, I don't know if it's going to work out either. I just was worried the copper band might try to eat it because it's a clam, and that is within their dietary choices. So, but, it could be fine. It could be fine. Please come to me with some good news and say, they love each other. I mean, I had 2 clams in my anemone tank years ago with 2 eels, and I would watch the eel swim over the top of the clam and lay down with its torso on top of the mantle of the clam. I thought, well, that's just crazy, and I'm surprised the clam is tolerating it, but whatever. And then one day, the shell was empty as the eel was eating the clam. I was like, oh man, I thought you guys were going to be buddies. And that was the last clam I bought, and that was a long time ago. Let's see. Rather Be Traveling says, I used or added All for Reef for my tank. The alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium stabilized very little fluctuations, and the corals started coloring up and growing. Yeah, alpha reef is great at maintaining and stabilizing the numbers, but if anything is out of whack, you need to make that manual correction before you use alpha reef. So if you had an alkalinity deficiency, you can't just use alpha reef and it's going to fix alkalinity. If your magnesium is super low, it will not correct it, but it'll maintain it. So you get everything right, and then you start dosing alpha reef, and the tank just grows. Mike says, dinos are the worst to deal with. Ostreopsis. I had that one in Caitlin's Reef. He said he added a few tanks in his tanks. The display tank always runs 0.5 phosphate and 50 plus ppm for nitrate. Aquabiomics came back with a great biodiversity, 79 out of 99 different bacterias, and you can still get them with high nutrients also. I just feel like dinos come up more frequently with these low nutrient brand new tanks that are built off dry everything. I'm not saying you can, I mean, look, 20 years ago, you came across 1 or 2 or 3 tanks a year where they had this horrible dinoflagellate infestation, and there would be these giant strands coming up like brown, bubbly hideousness. And then one tank I saw, and I have gone through my pictures so many times trying to find the pictures, and I hope one day I'll find it. The entire tank was like that green slime from Nickelodeon, just everywhere. It was unbelievable. It was like Willy Wonka threw up in the tank. And I was like, dude, I got to take pictures of your tank. I know you're totally mortified and embarrassed, but this is insane, and I've got to document this. And I can't find those pictures. But back then, people were using live sand, and they were getting sand from all their friends across the nation. We only would use live rock. Base rock was like stupid, you know? And a few people got dinos. So yeah, I know dinos can happen in a system that has high nutrients, but it seems to really be more prone with those low nutrient and new systems. Manuel says, my yellow leather closed and melted away. What could have caused it? I had it for 7 years. Well, first of all, I'm sorry that you lost it. And they can live forever. You know, it's possible. So, what would cause it to melt? I mean, it's a leather. They shed. Lack of flow. It just couldn't clean itself. Could be one reason. Some water parameter was way out of whack. Tank got too hot. That's a prone that could cause the leather to melt. Those are a few that come off the top of my head. I'm sorry you lost it. I would say because you kept one for so long, you should get a new frag and grow another pretty one again. That's what I'd suggest. But I don't think you should worry that every leather you ever put in your tank now will not make it. That might have been a one-off, or it might have just been a crisis. And, it happens, unfortunately. Reefed says, gyres are great, but 1 or 2 months in, and it's like a light switch. They need the citrus hydrochloric acid bath. Jake says, how long should I wait to add SPS to my tank? My frags have been peeling. Oh, well then, not yet. Something's really not right. I would say let your tank run for a good 9 months or so and get comfortable with it. I don't know. How long has your tank been running? Tell me that. But let's just say 9 months to a year, and then try something easy. Try like bird's nest and see how that does, or Passillipora. Those are super hardy SPS corals. They're great for starting off, and just see what they do. And if they do well, then maybe get some other SPS and see what happens with that, like an Acropora or a Montipora digitata. You know, Monte Digis are really good beginners again, but peeling is an RTN issue, or possibly an STN, but usually RTN. RTN stands for rapid tissue necrosis. I mean, when the skin's just peeling off the coral, it's pretty rapid. So something in your system, and it could even be a toxicity. Like, for example, you might have a sinularia in your tank, and sinularias hate Acropora. So they are putting a toxin into the water column, and the Acropora will just melt. I mean, that's just what it does. Running carbon in a reactor can help compete, but eventually you have to pick, do I want the sinularia or do I want the Acropora? And odds are you want the Acropora more. So I would say that. Now, there is one out there that is called Nephthia, and it is more SPS friendly, but it could be a chemical thing in your tank too. It could be you have an anemone that's stinging the crap out of it, just fluffs up really big and just touches it and then shrinks down by the time you look and you don't realize they're touching. That could be causing a coral to peel too. So there's a few different things. Sorry, I can't just spit out one-word answers to you guys. There's just lots of things to take into mind. Panopolis says, how much of a, I think you're saying detriment it is to have the RO filter run 2 or 3 times per week? That's okay. I like to run mine once a week. That's best. There are people that run theirs 7 times a day, and they're the ones that run into real problems because every single time the RO system starts up again, all the water sitting around the membrane pushes that TDS out the line into the DI resin, and they wipe out the DI resin more rapidly. It just depletes it because that first 1 minute goes 100 TDS, 200 TDS, and comes all the way back down to a low number, but that 1 minute's worth did the damage. And then the membrane kicking on and off frequently wears out the membrane prematurely. Membranes are designed to run long and hard. So if you could, like for example, mine's been on today, and I started it probably 10 o'clock, and it ran, well, it's still running, or it's trying to turn off now, because by now my top container is full. I had to fill it all the way up, and it had a long way to go. And so it's going to run for about 6, 7, 8 hours, and then it's done. I don't have to refill the container for another week. That's how I like to run it. But if you have it cycling on and off frequently, that can wear out the membrane, and it can definitely deplete the DI resin. Okay, Refeds gave us an update from RAP. They're trying to future-proof updating the Maven before release. I asked how the accuracy was, and they had no answer to give. Well, look, when they finally release it, you're going to get everyone's answer, and I have a feeling everyone's going to complain no matter what, just because that's what I've been seeing for so long. People have complained about every device on the planet. The only thing they seem to only believe is the HANA checkers. I mean, they compare everything to the HANA checker. Every single time you see a post, it's like, the HANA checker says this, so this Trident is lying. The HANA checker says this, so the Reef bot is lying. It's like, the HANA checker is the only thing you believe. But all of the devices have a margin of error, and ultimately you have to decide. When I came into this hobby, of course, I did the API test kits, because that's what you bought when you went to the fish store. And I soon learned Salifert was the only test kit to use. And I used Salifert for the longest time. 10, 12, 14 years. And then one day, I discovered, sometime in that period, I used Salifert exclusively. But then I stumbled across a little Tropic Marin test kit for alkalinity that was way easier than Salifert. And I was like, oh. And I started using that one. It was like a $10 kit, and I loved it. And then one day I won a contest on Facebook for ELOS test kits and fell in love with theirs. Number one, I like the vials, which I know sounds really ridiculous, but I love the vials. The tests were not hard to do. The magnesium was the hardest one, and I used them exclusively. And now I don't even know if we can get ELOS test kits here in the U.S. I've been just using what's left of my kits on the shelf, and same like with Predibia. So we'll see. Thank you. See, someone's explaining this word to me because I did not know what lingbia is, or lingbia. I don't know it. But Diacanthus Reef says lingbia is a type of filamentous cyanobacteria, and it can be toxic. So I didn't know it was called that, or I didn't know there's a version of it that's called that. So I couldn't really answer specifically to that item, but I can tell you that I've used ChemiClean or I've used Red Cyano RX to get rid of cyanobacteria successfully many, many times. If you have to use it once or twice a year to get rid of cyano, you can. And it's super easy to do. All you have to do is follow my instructions on my website, because I feel like I have the best instructions. And it's just because I know people would put stuff in. I mean, look, so many things in this hobby are all about perception. They perceived one thing, so they assume something else. And here's the weird thing about cyanobacteria. And then we'll move on to the next question. Cyanobacteria is photosynthetic. It shows up during the light period, and it goes away when the lights are off. And so if you are working all day and your tank turns red and you happen to come home for lunch, you're like, oh my God, what happened to my tank, right? And then you come home after dinner and you look at your tank and the sand looks kind of white. And like, oh, it looks good. It's okay. You might think it went away when all it did was go to sleep. And then the next day the lights come on and it turns red again. So now you're home for the weekend and it's red all weekend and you're freaking out. So you buy a product like ChemiClean and you put it in the tank. And then that night it goes away. You're like, oh, it's already gone. I'll do my water change. And they get rid of the chemical in the water. And then the next day they have cyanobacteria again that's visibly present. So the instructions on the package say to stop running carbon. If you have UV, just turn it off. There's no reason to run that. Put in the chemical in there. Don't run your skimmer. And they say add an air stone for oxygenation, which is very important. You should do that if you do not have really good circulation. My tanks have a lot of circulation, so I don't need to do the air stone, but I could if there was a need. I do not do the volcano protein skimmer. I turn off the skimmer, I remove the skimmer, and I soak it in acid to get it nice and clean. That is what I've been doing for the longest time. If I needed to add air, I would use an air stone with an air pump and bubbles in the water, okay? So you put in the chemical, you wait 3 days. After 72 hours, you look at the tank. If it's gone, do a water change. If it's not gone, put in another dose of ChemiClean or Red Cyano RX. I think they're the same. And wait 2 more days. At this point, it's completely gone. Now you can do your really big water change and you can put in your nice clean skimmer and you can turn it on and your skimmer will go crazy and it will dump a ton of fluid into the cup. And of course, you need to collect that into a bucket. My solution is you do the 3-day treatment. And like I said, if it doesn't work, run it for 2 more days with another batch. Then it's completely gone. Now you do the water change and you let the skimmer drain as much liquid as it wants. I don't care how much it is. If it's 9 gallons, it's 9 gallons. Just put in 9 gallons of salt water to replace what you removed. On my big system, it could be like 30 gallons or 40 gallons. I just let it drain all at once into a nearby bucket. As the bucket gets full, I move the hose to the next bucket. I take the first bucket, pour it down the toilet, and I just keep going. I just keep checking on the bucket until the skimmer settles down. And then at that point, all the chemicals gone from the system. I've had a really large water change in my tank, and my cyanobacteria is gone, and I'm happy. And it only took the 3 to 5 days of treatment, and then the 6 or 8 hours of dealing with the skimmer, and then everything's completely operational like it should be. So that's it. AJ's here, and he says he doesn't believe the formula is correct. You're so funny, buddy. Nice to see you in the chat. Panopolis says, morning coffee and evening beer go fantastic with Coral Magazine. That should be a full-page ad. I love that. Let's see. And Andrew's here. Hey, how's it going? AJ, thank you very much for the super chat. Hey, hang on. Oh, it's gone. Somewhere I had this button. I was going to do it for applause, but I don't know where it went. Oh, boo hiss. It was so cute. Wait. Thank you very much for that super chat. And no, I don't want an inch of detritus on the bottom of my sump. And yes, you should clean your sump. Panopolis says, it may just be me, but I like the vibe of you doing streams in the media room instead of in front of the main. Aw, AJ, thank you very much. That's awesome. After that, you'll never be my friend again. Oh, nice. He said that the reason I was adding Prime back then is that the water had a smell to it. Thank you. I did not remember that at all. That's awesome. Larry asked, at what phase of your tank did you decide to go with the calcium reactor? And I will add, I miss seeing your tank as well. You know what? I should just put up a video of the hideousness that it is now just to calm you guys down. And then you'll understand why I'm not showing it to you. It's just not great. I started a calcium reactor when I got my 280-gallon tank. It came with the calcium reactor. And I never looked back. I've been using that same reactor now for 21 years. I love it. It's great. Larry says, could you pick a Saturday to test your system and do a small amount in maintenance? We'd all benefit from the show. You know, I've thought about doing that, but like, you know, when I was out in the studio a couple months ago and did a stream, as I walked around, the microphone was like fading in and out instead of staying continuous. I was wearing my good mic. I was like, I don't understand what happened there. I need to do some further testing first to verify it's going to be stable. Because if I'm, and then again, it's like, how much can you possibly see? If I had a second person like following me around with a camera, that's a little different because now you can actually see what's going on and I can talk to the camera, but I can't really see the questions. I'd almost need them to tell me what the questions are on the screen. I don't know. It's a little complicated, but yeah, there's definitely possibilities of doing some of these things. And if it's a horrible failure, we can go right back to this room. So maybe we should try it. Jerome says, is there brown coralline or is that just cyano? Actually, coralline can be blue, green, or pink. But brown is usually a type of algae. It's not coralline algae. It's a more stubborn one that's kind of hard to scrape off. Sometimes it'll appear on your glass, or it might be appear on the overflow box. But it's not coralline. And if the water gets exposed, you do a water change, and the coralline gets exposed, it could turn white. Doesn't necessarily die, but sometimes it does. But sometimes it'll hold its own for a little while, and then you add the new water, and it's okay. Sometimes that white flakes off, and it's gone. AJ says he helped me do a reset once before, and that his back hurt for a day thereafter. Final thoughts about our hobby. No, I never have final thoughts. The hobby goes on forever. Let's see. Johnny says, is it bad that my pH goes up to 8.5 during the day, and then during the night it can be as low as 7.9? That's a big swing. To go from 7.9 to 8.5 is a 0.6 swing. Most aquariums have a variance of 0.2. So something's going on. It could be what you're dosing, how you're dosing it, what you're using that's creating this high spike. I'm not sure what it is, but it's important that you find a way to stabilize that. You should be adding alkalinity during the early morning hours. Like you said, when the tank is at 7.9, if you're dosing alkalinity between, like, let's say 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., that might buffer that up and get you around 8.1. And then hopefully later in the day, your tank gets up to 8.3 or so. And it could just be, I think you should calibrate your pH probe anyway, but a 0.6 swing is huge. Something's going on. Jeremy, I want you to post a picture of that in Club Mila's Reef so we can take a look. Because I need to see this. All right, guys. You've heard it earlier in this presentation, so I want to remind you, it is Water Test Saturday. Please do test your water parameters. And if you're in the local area and you want to come hang out with me tomorrow, I will be walking around at Reefapalooza. Let's see what other upcoming events are happening here. I've got a note here somewhere. There is a reptile and freshwater saltwater show here in Dallas, March 29th and 30th. Reefapalooza, Florida is in April, the 26th and 27th. The Dallas Aquashella is May 17th through 18. Reef Retreat is going to be in Rhode Island, June 6th through 8. There's an Aquashella that's happening in Los Angeles, which I can't believe. It's hard to get in LA. So there's more shows coming up this year. So you need to go to these things and attend them. And if you're part of a club, go to your club events. If there's frag swaps, go to those. If there's coral shows, go to those. Going to these events, you get to hang out with others that love the hobby like you do, and you might find something really cool to bring home with you. Guys, I appreciate you being on the stream. We had 99 on right now at the end of the show, and we've been talking for 2 hours and 18 minutes. I really do appreciate you guys every single week, and I will see you again next Saturday. Bye.